What's up, nerds? We're back with another faction tier list, and this time we've got the U.S. forces, highly anticipated and asked for, and so we're going to be breaking it down similar to our last video with Wehrmacht, where we're not going to pay too much attention to how long it takes us to go through, but the structure is going to be essentially the same. You can see the units I've organized here by their teching order, and the tech tree that they're available in, and then following that we'll go through the battle groups, all the battle group units as well, and then we'll actually finish with the support centers, which is unique to US forces in COH3. So with that, let's jump into it. Before we get started in the tier list, I just want to do a quick overview of the tech structures. So just going to go back here, look at U.S. forces. We'll get into these battle groups a little bit later. Talking about the buildings as well, the support centers, we will go through also at the end. But starting with the tech structures, I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And the headquarters will be referring to as Tier 0. Barracks is Tier 1. Weapon Support Center is Tier 2. And Motor Pool is Tier 3. And then, of course, Tank Depot is Tier 4. So jumping into the tier list itself, available in Tier 0, we have Scouts, Engineers, and the Captain if you go for the Infantry Support Center. Starting out, I am a big fan of the Scout unit. I think it has a very specific purpose, and it serves that purpose within the US roster very well. Similar to the Kettenkrad, but with much more combat power and a little bit of different utility for US forces. I think this is a staple unit that's pretty essential to keep alive at all stages of the game. And the flare package as well as the smoke provide excellent utility. And as the unit scales, increasing the capture speed is a really nice touch to the veterancy changes that it got recently, along with all of the other units. And so for that reason, and as well as its combat performance, I'm putting it in the strong category. Keep in mind, guys, for the most part, like, I'm going to be measuring these units on the basis of their individual merits and taking less into consideration the context in which they might be used. So some of you might say, like, well, scouts are garbage in team games because basically they just capture the first points and then I don't really use them very much after that. Well, first of all, shame on you because you should be using your scouts a lot more. But secondly, I also want to measure like the unit as an individual. And this is going to be like in the context of primarily like a 1v1 setting. But we are going to talk about like the team game components that are going to be relevant as well. So as far as the Scout's combat power goes, it doesn't really beat anything. It's a decent supporting unit. If we switch over to like the DPS calculator here, I'll just pull up the Scout really quickly so you guys can see the comparison between the Scout and a standard Rifleman squad for US forces here. You can see that they have about the same max range DPS, and the Scout's DPS doesn't get much better outside of that. But you'll also notice that the DPS curve it has is very flat. So this unit is best used in combat at pretty much maximum range if possible. And obviously it's also very fragile. So you do want to be careful about like trying to close the gap or be too aggressive with the Scout. How the Scout should generally be used is by escorting a lot of your team weapons or your riflemen. Basically anywhere you're going, especially in the early game, before you engage the enemy, you want to have the Scout nearby so you can anticipate and position for what you're going to have to deal with from your opponent. Obviously, early access to flares is critically important right now because of the strength of a lot of the cloaked and stealth units in the early game from both Axis factions, but more so with Wehrmacht. And how I've been generally fitting in these into my builds in 1v1s is I find myself often building a 2-Scout opener into a Jeep, which we'll talk about shortly. This gives me excellent map presence and early capture power. It also gives me lots of information and vision about my opponent. so I can see where they are and how they're moving their troops on the map before I choose where I'm going to engage them, which is super important if you're planning to use Rifleman especially, but even more so with Weapon Support Center, which we'll also talk about. Yeah, I think 2 Scout Opener is very good because they scale very well. They also get experience from capturing territory, which is a mechanic that is unique to them. Similar to what I spoke about in the Kettenkrad, in the Wehrmacht video regarding the Kettenkrad, is having this unit to kind of vacuum up the territory points as you're pushing in with your combat troops is a great way to get these guys to Vet 3 as quickly as possible, where they're going to, add extra utility, have extra vision, and be more durable, which is really nice. In terms of their veterancy options, I tend to favor the smoke drop for the purpose of their survivability. Like I mentioned, keeping the scouts alive is pretty important for the purpose of information gathering and recon throughout the game. And sometimes you can get caught out in some dicey situations with the scout, and the smoke can help alleviate some of the pain of that. So that's the scout. The American Engineer, also I'm going to put in the strong category. As far as engineers go, it doesn't have exceptional combat power. It will beat Grenadiers if it manages to jump on top of them at close range and not take damage on the approach. So think about like running around the corner to a building or hiding behind a sight blocker. The combat engineers will be effective for that purpose. They have access to satchels, which are great tools for clearing out team weapons, bunkers, and buildings in the early game. I can't tell you guys how many times I've lost some team weapons, kind of forgetting about this and underestimating the engineer. You can trust that if you throw a satchel on an Axis team weapon, it will die. It will definitely die if it gets hit by the satchel. Fun fact, if you have thrown a satchel at an enemy machine gun team and they have not started packing up before you throw the satchel, it is guaranteed to die. They cannot pack up and get away from it fast enough in order to clear it. So keep that in mind when you're planning your attacks. And if you've noticed that like you're about to throw a satchel on a machine gun team and your opponent is late to pack up, then you want to position yourself to steal the machine gun, because that's a huge win. Playing US and stealing one of those German machine guns is really, really nice. Complements your composition really well, and obviously taking that firepower out of your opponent's hand is super critical. On top of that, they have some great veterancy with the, I forget exactly what it's called, actually. I should really dig into that. Let me pull open the engineer unit here for just a minute. Their second veterancy option called, here it is, Superior Fieldcraft. I always forget the name of this. So it increases your repair rate by 2 health per second, increases construction rate by 25%, and increases your mine detection range. Just fantastic utility on all of the things that the engineer needs throughout the game. I'm almost never taking Lighted Up because it is a static ability that can only be used in one specific place. It's very easy for your opponent to dodge if they're paying attention, and it deals a very slow damage over time. Superior Fieldcraft is just categorically better across the board for everything that you're wanting to use the engineer for in the first place. So that really also adds into why the US engineer is in the strong category. Because it basically means that once you get Vet 1, you have better repairs than all of your counterparts, and also having access to the satchel. Despite not having the best combat power, this thing is definitely a strong unit. That takes us to the captain. Now, obviously, some of you are going to be like, wait a minute. The captain is attached to ISC. Yes, that is true. The captain is automatically deployed when you invest in the Infantry Support Center from the Support Center options. If you lose the captain, though, it can be rebuilt from the headquarters for 150 manpower. And I would virtually always recommend doing this because of how valuable the captain is, because the captain is in the OP category. The reason why the captain is in the OP category is because not only is he a very capable combat unit, but the utility that he provides to surrounding troops, along with the shared veterancy, makes this just the perfect augment to exactly what you need to support heavy infantry-based compositions. If I'm playing a Rifleman build, Infantry Support Center is bar none the best option, period. Now, in team game scenarios, we'll talk about support centers a little bit more. There are situations where I think MSC can be competitive as well. The Mechanized Support Center. Air Support Center, I still can't really recommend to this day. And I'll actually talk about why I have 2 Howitzers here at the end. But Infantry Support Center, I mean, the captain is really like what sets the Infantry Support Center apart as like probably the strongest support center option. In addition to the tech bonuses that you can get from Infantry Support Center, the captain is just, it's just an exceptional unit. So let's break down exactly why the captain is so good. Like I mentioned, not only is he a very capable combat unit, this is actually incorrect. I need to get the 30 cal. No, maybe it's the 1919. Yeah, here we go. The Rifleman 1919. So you'll notice here, the captain actually has more long-range damage than Rifleman does. This means, like, how you effectively want to use the captain is parking him at long range, also because he's very fragile, but basically, like, he should be slightly behind your troops in and every engagement possible as well. The reason why is if we break open the captain here, we see that he has a leadership passive that increases the experience gain of nearby allied infantry. This is super important to making sure that your riflemen or whatever other infantry you're using are adequately scaling into the late game. So whether you're using paratroopers, SSFs, whatever line unit you're choosing to use with US forces, having the captain nearby is incredibly important to helping them scale into the late game. And like I mentioned, it's a very fragile unit, so having this guy post up in a building or in cover somewhere, green cover, just having him park and chip away at your opponent's units at long range, he has very decent and respectable long range damage, and your opponent is probably going to want to close the gap, which means he's only going to deal more damage. Now, for a 3-person team, you can see, like, the DPS is very respectable at all ranges, but it's kind of nice that it flattens out at long range and makes him effective in that capacity. So outside of his combat capabilities, I really want to talk about specifically his abilities. His abilities are what make him so strong. So the first is flanking maneuver. This is a suppression breaking tool that allows you to grant a speed bonus to one infantry unit, and it also makes that unit harder to hit and take 50% less suppression when moving. This means, like, the best way to effectively close the gap is using a leapfrog maneuver, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to Rifleman. But basically, you're wanting to use the captain to engage the enemy, then boost a squad to engage in a flank that's allowing you to get either around a machine gun or even just like an enemy in a good cover position. So flanking maneuver, this is an exceptional ability, and when used, especially on like riflemen, it just allows them to close the gap, get in the face of your opponent, and maximize their DPS while minimizing the amount of damage that they take. And you can also rescue some infantry units from situations where they're getting suppressed or pinned, but you don't want to retreat them back to base. You can use flanking maneuver to safely pull them out. One trick that I want to call out specifically about flanking maneuver and the German machine guns is that pay attention to how long the German machine gun burst duration is. Generally, what you want to do is German machine guns tend to have a burst duration between 3 and 5 seconds. As you see it about to end, that's when you want to use the flanking maneuver, because that time in between bursts is going to give the squad the time that they need to get around the enemy machine gun position and flush them out with a grenade or whatever else you're choosing to use. On top of his other abilities, so previous to this patch, the forward mortar observer mortar barrage was very popular. It was very nice because it was basically a free mortar barrage that you could use to dislodge a machine gun or get an enemy out of a building or what have you. It's still useful in that capacity, but I do want to call out, like, Mark Vehicle, from my perspective, is easily, like, probably the strongest single target debuff in the game. It's particularly when it comes to vehicles. The reason why is because of, well, there's a few things. Number one, the target becomes easier to hit. This is really important when it comes to dealing with light vehicles like the Flak Vierling, for example, because the Flak Vierling has a relatively small target size and is able, I mean, it causes you to miss a lot of shots on it with AT guns, with other anti-tank weapons. You'll notice that, like, a lot of times it's going to miss. But this really alleviates the probability of missing and makes the target much more likely to hit. So that means if you're chasing it with, like, a Greyhound or a Chaffee or a gun motor carriage 75mm half-track, your probability of hitting it even on the move is very, very good. And I would say as long as marked vehicle is on, you can pretty much count on the fact that you're probably going to be able to hit it on the move. On top of that, we also have 25% additional damage. I think this might be the only damage buff, or damage debuff that exists in the game that I can think of, at least for vehicles. And you guys can imagine how important this is when it comes to dealing with some of the German super tanks, like the Panther, the King Tiger, and the Tiger. And then on top of that, you're also increasing your probability to penetrate it with anti-tank fire, because it's going to reduce your opponent's armor and make it easier for your units to penetrate the front, sides, and rear, of course. But essentially, guys, what you're using this for is to set up opportunities to kill priority vehicles that your opponent has. And as you guys know, there's some really oppressive ones that the Axis have access to. And the extra 25% damage, easier to hit, and incoming weapon penetration all make a big difference in being able to kill it versus not being able to. I have some great games where I managed to use this quite well. And so I would recommend, like, I'll put some links in the description to some of those battle group how-to videos and examples. But, like, I have to say, like, I have been using Mark Vehicle pretty much every single time since this patch, this 2.0 patch. So all of these reasons is what puts Captain in the S tier. It's a very, it's a perfectly capable, like, honestly, it's kind of mediocre combat unit. I like to think of, like, putting the scout and the captain together acts as, like, kind of like a super rifleman squad in a way. But no, for the most part, combat capability is perfectly respectable, but the utility that you get from the captain is really what makes it worthwhile. And that is also why I recommend, if you've lost the captain, it's almost always worth the 150 manpower to rebuild it. So with that, we'll get into tier 1. This is the barrack structure. This is my favorite tech structure to play with, but I will admit tier 2 is probably stronger and more competitive, generally speaking, and we'll talk about why when we get there. But getting started, we'll talk about the Jeep, the Rifleman, and the Mortar. So the Jeep. The Jeep is, I think, a pretty underrated unit right now. I think a lot of people kind of forget about it. This is another example of a unit that has fantastic utility and has decent scaling. It has a strong early game and it can apply good early game pressure and has decent scaling specifically through its utility. So getting into the Jeep, let's go back here and pull up the Jeep. I figured it's probably useful to have the visual aids on screen for you guys so that you can see what I'm talking about exactly. I think it's called the quarter-ton truck. Yeah, this is it. It does not have a side skirt upgrade. That's hilarious. So, the Jeep. Typically, if I'm building tier 1, The Jeep is the first unit that I'm going to build, unless I'm planning to go a pure Rifleman composition and not build the Jeep at all. But I would say the mistake that I see a lot of players make when it comes to the Jeep is they build it too late. If you're planning on building the Jeep, it should be the first unit that you build from tier 1. The reason why is because the Jeep, because of its speed, you're able to get across the map quickly and find an isolated unit to deal damage to and chip away at. What that's going to do, your mission with the Jeep is to get it to Vet 1. Now, if you're going Armor Battle Group, you don't have to worry about this as much. But if you're not playing Armor Battle Group, which, you know, I think most of the time people... I mean, there's 4 other ones, so I'd say this is going to be the situation most of the time. You want to get the Jeep to Vet 1 because that's where his scaling potential starts to come alive. So what you want to do is you want to get in your opponent's face, find a Pioneer, find a Grenadier, do some chip damage on them, and then pull away and use the self-repair ability to get it back to full health, and then repeat. Rinse and repeat the cycle. Now, my standard build order when I've been going for Jeep has been 2 scouts, 2 scouts, Jeep, 2 riflemen, engineer, and then usually I'm going for infantry support center. But if you want to go for another support center like mechanized support center, I wouldn't recommend getting that until a little bit later, maybe after you build your tier 2 or your tier sorry, you can't build it before your tier 3. So as you're going into your tier 3, I should say. But if you're going ISC, getting 2 riflemen is completely fine. And then you can always get the 3rd one a little bit later. I talk about this a little bit more in my heavy weapons battle group how-to video. I'll link in the description. But that is a very well-rounded composition. The scouts give you great early map presence. The Jeep you use to basically slow down your opponent and allow your scouts to kind of like get tempo in terms of capturing territory and getting to the defensive positions that are in the center of the map before your opponent's able to. If your opponent tries to beeline it straight for the center of the map and they get intercepted by the Jeep, they can't ignore it. They have to respect it. They have to get into cover position. Otherwise, the Jeep is just going to bully them off the map and chase them back to base and or potentially kill the unit if they're super careless. So, for all of that reason, all of those reasons, and we'll talk about the scalability of the Jeep, I am putting the Jeep in the strong category. I think in the wrong hands, or, you know, if your timing is off, or if you're not using the Jeep for its late game purposes, you would probably consider this an average or bad unit, but let me make a case for you as to why it's strong. So cracking back open the unit card here, there are 3 things that make the Jeep really strong in the late game. In early game, it's good for 2 things. Number 1, harassing enemy squads and slowing down their tempo for capturing the map. This is also especially true, guys, for the Kradschützen and the Kettenkrad. The Jeep is the perfect hunter unit for those 2 to slow them down and keep them from capturing and vacuuming up the map and the territory while your scouts are kind of running up the map and getting into position. There isn't any other unit besides the Weasel, and even that can't do it right away because you have to purchase the machine gun upgrade. We'll talk about that later. But the Jeep is the perfect hunter unit for the Kradschützen and the Kettenkrad, and that's what you want to be prioritizing in the early game. Now, hopefully, if you've done some good damage to your opponent, and you've got your Vet 1. Oh, by the way, also good. Not bad at like dealing chip damage to the 250 before it gets before it gets the armor upgrade. I forgot to mention that for DAC. Having the Jeep kind of like keep it long range and deal chip damage to the 250 while combining that with efforts from your riflemen or other units nearby is perfectly fine way to apply pressure to the DAC player and kind of make them want to get those half-track upgrades, which is going to slow down their infantry tempo and some other things. Anyways, so the Jeep really comes alive when it hits Vet 1 because you have access to 2 options and they're both useful in different circumstances. The first one is capturing territory. Personally, I would usually recommend this specifically in a 1v1 context because Obviously, the ability to deny capture points or quickly respond to your opponent that's maybe capturing with like a fringe engineer unit. The Jeep can interrupt that and stop them from decapturing territory or stop them from capturing territory, and then be kind of like your rapid response unit in the super early game for maintaining territory control, and only serves to bolster your territory control capabilities that you've already got with however many scouts you happen to have. This opens up and allows you to focus your riflemen on combat the whole game, 24/7 if possible, because you've got your scouts, you've got your Jeep in the background that can be capturing the territory after your riflemen clear and push through an area. So like I mentioned, I usually recommend this in a 1v1 context because territory doesn't tend to change hands as much in team games, because there's a lot more opposition that you have to deal with, and you don't really get a chance to make good use of this as much as you would like to. This brings us to the resupply platform. This is a great ability for building tempo. A lot of people will be like, Havoc, why on earth would you want to pay munitions for something that you can just build from your base? I'll tell you why. Because manpower is the most important resource, especially in the early game for US forces. The ability to pay 75 munitions for either a 30 caliber machine gun, which, you know, if you haven't built Weapon Support Center, think about how much you have to invest if you started with a rifleman composition, okay? Weapon Support Center costs 100 manpower and 15 fuel, and then the machine gun team itself, I believe, is 250 manpower. That's 350 manpower and 15 fuel for a machine gun team, okay? On the other side, if we drop a machine gun and crew it with an engineer squad, for example, the engineer reinforcements cost 24 manpower each. So that means that it would be 100 manpower to completely about 100. It's 96, I think. 100 manpower to reinforce your engineer squad and then top up the machine gun that you just dropped. And in the early game, when you're trying to apply pressure to the map or lock down territory or whatever, being able to drop the machine gun on the front line and use it right away rather than having to build it from base can give you the tempo that you need to build your advantage. And that's what the US forces is all about. It's all about tempo. It's all about building an advantage in the early game, because if you don't, a lot of your vehicles will get outscaled. I'm not going to lie. There are some that don't, but most of them do. And for that reason, you need to make sure that your infantry are scaling, make sure your riflemen are scaling, and that you're able to build a resource advantage that you can convert into a late game win. Or better yet, win in the early game. That's possible too. So, we talked about resupply platform. The other nice thing about this is you can actually bait your opponent into trying to kill this and wasting munitions on it. By if your Jeep is at full health and you bait your opponent to Faust it, and then you use the self-repair ability, it will go back to full health and you can continue to move the vehicle. That's a really nice, that's kind of like a high level, like cheeky mechanic that you can use. And it will also help keep your Jeep alive. In addition to all of this, this is, again, and the nice thing is you can drop these weapons also for your teammates, like the M1 Mortar. We'll talk about the M1 Mortar shortly, but like there is definitely a case and a reason on why you would want to drop an M1 Mortar for your teammate rather than forcing them to build their own, right? On top of all this, you also have the Scout Commander. The Scout Commander provides the same sort of utility that the what is it called? Radio antenna upgrade does for the 221 and the 254. It gives you that like pulse ability that will show your opponent's units in the fog of war. How you want to be using this with the Jeep is park the Jeep close to the front line, but somewhere safe, behind some kind of structure or sight blocker or shot blocker, like a big rock or a building or something like that. And it's going to give you a ton of valuable information through the recon pulse that's going to go into the area around the Jeep. This is what you use the Jeep for in the mid and late game. You're not using it for combat anymore. I promise you, if you use it for combat after 6 minutes, it's gonna die. Like, you're gonna lose it, and you're gonna miss out on all of these excellent bonuses that serve to provide some utilitarian purposes throughout the mid game and the late game. So keep your Jeep alive. Get it upgraded with the Scout Commander. If you're playing team games, use the resupply platform. Drop, if you have munitions floating, you got like, a whole bunch of munitions that you don't know how to spend, drop machine guns for your teammates. Drop an M1 mortar for them. The M1 mortar is the best mortar in the game. We'll talk about it shortly. But like dropping an M1 mortar for your teammate can make such a difference for them. Or even for yourself, right? Like rather than building a mortar, drop one for yourself. Drop two. Anyway, it comes with kind of a munition sink, but it's great for tempo. That's kind of the point. So all of that is the reason why the Jeep is in the strong category rather than just being a bad or average early game vehicle. This takes us to Rifleman. This is basically the staple infantry unit of U.S. forces. When you think of U.S. forces, you think of Riflemen, basically. Boy, they've had a real journey in the last few patches. And I think I'm going to get some really... I was really hesitating about doing this, but I'll say this. I'll preface with this. The Rifleman overall is a strong unit, but it's not because the performance of the unit is strong. It's because the economy of the unit is strong. So I actually think that the Rifleman, as far as line infantry goes, is very average. And the reason why I feel that way is because if you don't dump a lot of fuel into investing in your Rifleman through logistics, through survival upgrades, through bars, grenades, all of that stuff, if you're not dumping fuel into your Rifleman, they're actually not very good. They will lose to Panzer Grenadiers with combined arms. They will lose to Grenadiers up to Vet 2. Now, once the Riflemen hit Vet 2, they're actually very good, and especially with bars. Then they really start to perform, but the trouble is usually getting there in the early game without like dealing with some pretty insurmountable losses, because they're very fragile and they have a close range DPS profile that makes them more difficult to use than some of their Axis counterparts. So we'll compare them here to like Panzer Grenadiers, right? So let's say, your average Panzer Grenadier squad with combined arms, their stats actually get better than this. So you can see, like, once you get veteran squad leaders on Panzer Grenadiers, they are just better than Riflemen. They're just straight up better. And that makes sense. They are more expensive. They are 300 manpower. But in the early game, you'll notice, like, you're pretty much like kind of even with them unless they have combined arms, and then again they get better than Riflemen. But you can see the Rifleman has like a close range DPS profile. Let's compare that with like the Grenadier here, for example. The Grenadiers, and I talked about this in my Wehrmacht video, basically, like, if the Grenadiers are able to engage you with numbers and at range, it becomes very difficult to win engagements and close the gap so that you can be effective within the ranges that the Riflemen are going to be best. You tend to like drop models and unfortunately like lose squad members. That brings you to a point where it's not possible to win those engagements. And so that's what makes Riflemen so difficult to use in the early game, especially in team games, right? Like constantly running into machine guns or confronting, an Axis blob can be very, very difficult. So generally how you want to play with Riflemen is you want to be a little bit more conservative in the early game. Use opportunities to creep up small distances from cover to cover using the leapfrog tactic. Basically what I mean by this is like the reason why 2 or more Riflemen are strong together is because you want your opponent to focus on one of them at a time. So one rifleman is going to provide a base of fire from a cover position, while the second rifleman is closing the gap. If your opponent is really good and they're paying attention, they're going to be taking shots at the rifleman that's moving from cover to cover. That's going to create an opening for you to then move your other rifleman, so that your opponent is constantly having to juggle their target priority between at least 2 or more riflemen. One-on-one, riflemen will win a lot of engagements, but if the Axis player is kind of like doing what they ought to be doing and keeping their units together, it's rare that you're going to get situations where you're going to be able to engage their units 1v1, unless you're playing in a 1v1 game and you happen to be spread out all over the map. And this is really the secret to using these guys most effectively in a 1v1 context, is finding those 1v1 engagements and or playing defensively until you have a numerical advantage and you can close the gap. Anything else, like if you're playing 2 grenadiers against 2 riflemen, generally speaking, and the grenadiers have vet 1 and they start the engagement at max range, you're actually probably going to lose. So how you want to use them is engage with cover. This is the break point at which riflemen start to beat grenadiers. So just so you guys can kind of eyeball this distance, think about how far can infantry engage each other from. It's about 35 range, you can see here, right? You need to find a way to close the gap so that you're about 1/3 of the total distance of the max range of an engagement away from the grenadier, and then you will start winning. That is the secret to using riflemen. Now I also mentioned that, like, as far as the unit itself goes, I think it performs on a very average basis, but what makes it strong is the economy. The American medical tent is easily, I mean, the Germans have, the Wehrmacht specifically has the medical bunker, which offers the same benefits, but it will come out later. But the American medical tent is what makes riflemen strong because of the casualty recovery mechanic. That allows you to get free models back that are recovered by medics. And in a team game context, this comes into play a little bit more if you're using the advanced infantry battle group, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, the ability to collect casualties, it's actually a big part of also what makes these guys stronger in 1v1s, because your medical tent is a lot closer to the front line in a 1v1 map than it is on a 4v4 map. Right? That means more casualties collected by your medics, more free reinforcements are given back into your squad. So the economy is what makes riflemen so good, the free reinforcements, and then the scaling over the course of the game with the fuel investment. But as for the units, like performance itself, prior to Vet 2, they're actually quite weak. It's not until Vet 2 and beyond they really start to become worth their weight. And like I said, you also have to invest a significant amount of fuel in them through bars and grenades. That takes us to the M1 Mortar. The M1 Mortar is OP. As far as mortars go, this is the best one in the game by far. And what makes the Mortar so good specifically is the air burst that it has at Vet 1. It also has the... Americans name everything the M1, don't they? Like, geez. Here we go. So the M1, to my knowledge, it has the least scatter, which means it is the most precise when using barrage and attack abilities. And the access to the airburst barrage, this thing is basically like a super mortar. Like, it will damage everything in a much larger area of effect than a standard mortar would. And as you can see, both of these mortar abilities are super cheap. 20 munitions, it's less than a grenade. So continuously using this against your opponent's defensive positions, specifically machine guns, is really like the difference between getting completely bullied out of the game by MG42s and being able to continuously apply pressure and give your riflemen space to move and close the gap where they're going to be most effective. You also have access to the delayed HE fuse HE barrage. This is good if your opponent is building a lot of bunkers on the front line. But generally speaking, like, you can deal with bunkers in other ways. I feel like the airburst is probably the better choice, like 95% of the time. Like I mentioned, as far as mortars go, this is the best one by far. Better than the Wehrmacht, even better than the DAC mortar half-track, I would argue, in terms of DPS and performance. And the nice thing is that this also carries over to the mortar pit variant, which we'll talk about at the end of the tree. So OP as far as mortars go, the M1 mortar is the best. This takes us to Weapon Support Center. Now, I mentioned earlier that Weapon Support Center, I believe, is probably the more competitive tech choice in the early game compared to the barracks. And the reason for that is, it really comes down to the Rifleman versus the 1919. Riflemen, like I mentioned, they require a lot of fuel investment to help them scale into the late game. Once they are there, they're quite good. They're very, very strong. If you're not planning on building your composition around Riflemen, I would recommend a Weapon Support Center opener that you're leading with a combination of at least 2 scouts, an engineer, and machine guns. As long as you're properly supporting and providing vision for your machine guns with the scouts, these guys are like crazy OP. And what makes them crazy OP is the damage resistance that they get access to right from the jump. And this can even be added on top of further once you unlock the 1919's Vet 1 ability, which I think is called like Enhanced Defensive Position. What is it called? Improved Defensive Setup. So you can see improves the bonus of defensive setup from 20 to 30% when the squad is in cover or garrisons. This means that your machine gun is going to be far less susceptible to any damage, any source of damage that your opponent can put out. And in the early game, how this composition usually starts to shape up is I'll do like a double scout opener, then I'll just do 2 1919s, and the scouts and the 1919s kind of work as tandem teams, where the scout is providing vision and the 1919 is providing the firepower. As long as your machine guns are kept close to each other, whether you're playing against DAC or Wehrmacht, it's a very strong opener. The things you kind of have to look out for when it comes to Wehrmacht specifically is the cloaked MGs, because you can still get ambushed by them even if you have scouts. But if you're playing against like Grenadiers or whatever, by the time you get a third 1919 out, these become very difficult to work around. They have a really quick setup and teardown time, which allows them to pivot and respond to threats quickly. And when you combine that with scout, as long as none of them, you're not getting surprised by any squad flanking you because of your scout vision, it's really, really difficult to dislodge these. And like I mentioned, because of the damage resistance they have, even if your opponent manages to get some kind of like mortar or indirect fire, these guys don't take that much damage, so you're never really under threat of losing them. It's just a matter of like, how quickly can you reposition and set up and get more value and damage out of the 1919 before eventually having to backtrack and heal or return to base or what have you. So these guys, like, they're not the best machine gun in the game in terms of damage or suppression. Their durability and their quick responsiveness in terms of their pack-up time and setup time is what makes them so strong. Now, sorry, I'm just going to take a drink here. Now, let's talk about bazookas. Bazookas... Last patch, I would have put them in the strong category. This patch, I'm putting them in average. The reason why I think they've dropped a tier between this patch and the last patch has to do specifically with the lethality that was added to a whole bunch of the medium tanks in the game. P3s, P4s specifically, they got significant buffs to their machine guns, along with all of the other tanks. Pretty much every medium tank in the game got buffs to the machine guns, and that makes these guys a lot more fragile. They are still super useful in the early game, especially when you're backing up 1919s and playing against DAC. I'll say, like, anytime you're playing against DAC, once they see that you've gone for a couple 1919s, maybe 2 or 3, they pretty much have to go 250 because they don't really have any super early game indirect fire options. And if they don't get a 250, there's no way that they're going to be able to close the gap and get on top of the machine gun team to flank it if your scout is properly escorting it. What that means is that if they're going to go for a 250, all you need to do is build a bazooka to deter the push. And once you've done that, if you manage to, keep a 250 from diving on your machine guns, you'll be able to essentially slowly choke the DAC player out of the game. Just by continuously taking up space, slowly advancing your scouts and your machine guns, the DAC player is not going to be able to maneuver because the bazooka is going to keep them from getting around you. So building 1 or 2 of these in the early game is not a bad idea, especially if you're having to deal with light vehicles. But I will say, like, once the mediums start to come out, these guys start to fall off a little bit. Much harder than they did last patch because of the significant buffs that a lot of the medium tanks ended up getting on the DPS side, specifically with their machine guns. So overall, like, the unit still very useful for its specific purpose of providing a light anti-tank variant. I also think their passive is quite strong. Let's pull open the unit card so we can take a quick look here. Boy, wouldn't that be nice if they could get a Panzerschreck upgrade. Their abilities are decent. I think the white phosphorus rocket is probably generally more useful. The ability to launch one of these, once you get Vet 1, and launch one of these at like an Axis team weapon is a great way to use this unit. It's going to deal damage and provide a smoke screen that's going to allow you to apply pressure and close the gap. There have been lots of games where I am doing a lot of tier 1 into tier 2 compositions. And if I'm getting a bazooka, generally I'm going to also use this white phosphorus rocket to set up attacks for my riflemen as well. Their passive is, it's solid. It's a great way to, like, having them set up inside of a building or other cover position and use this passive to kind of plink away at any light vehicles that could be in range is a great way to use them. But, like, generally I'm being a little bit less aggressive with my bazooka squads now than I was last patch, because last patch it was a lot more forgiving and you were taking less damage in general from some of the medium variants. And so I'd say these guys scale a little bit less well, but still very solid for what you need them for in the early game. That takes us to the sniper. As far as sniper units go, I talked about how the Wehrmacht sniper is bad and not really great at, like, creating space or creating tempo. All of the same sort of things sort of apply to the American sniper. The main difference with the American sniper is when it comes to veterancy, the American sniper gets survivability, which is actually really nice. Because the biggest issue with snipers as they scale throughout the game is, like, they're susceptible to getting dove or picked off by light vehicles. And with the American sniper getting access to, I think it gets like 80 extra HP or something crazy at Vet 3. Here we go. 80 extra health at Vet 3 just makes it, like, super, super beefy. Like, really hard to kill. Even if you flank it. It's 180 health squad member, so it becomes very, very, very strong. Overall, though, I still feel like it has more drawbacks than it has benefits in general. You still have the same issue of, like, you're investing a significant amount of manpower that you're not able to convert into map presence or tempo. And so for that reason, I'm putting the sniper in the bad category. The M3. This is the base M3 that's available through the Weapon Support Center. You guys, if you've been playing a lot, you'll notice that for those of you that like the Mechanized Support Center, the buildable half-track variants were moved into the motor pool. So this is really the only unit that you can build straight from the Weapon Support Center, but you can still upgrade it into any of these other half-track variants. Now this M3 specifically is in the strong category. The Top Gun on it is very good, and the timing on it is better than any other half-track in the game. This is probably outside of the 250. Let me think about this. Yeah, I think outside of the 250, this is the fastest light vehicle that you can access, because Weapon Support Center is relatively cheap. And as long as you're quick on getting like your infantry support center or whatever else, you can get the M3 out between 4.5 and 5.5 minutes, depending on whether or not you're using armor battle group with the fast deploy, which we'll talk about as well. The Top Gun on it is very strong. It has very solid armor. It can tank like a full Panzerfaust and not receive engine damage, just the crew shock. And obviously the on the field reinforcement capabilities combined with the Top Gun on it make this a really, really solid choice for the early game while you're deciding how you're going to choose your upgrade path post the initial. So using this for like a few minutes as just the base level half track before you decide what upgrade you're going to use is not a bad idea, especially if you've done a weapon support center start and you haven't gone for barracks at all. So M3 overall very strong. I do want to touch on a new ability for the M3 that a lot of people seem to not know about. If I can find it here. Personnel carrier. So you obviously have your conversion kits. You also have the assault carrier conversion, which is really nice. But what I want to talk about is fortify position. This is a new veterancy upgrade that was introduced in the 2.0 patch. A lot of people don't know about this. What this is it allows you to place down a fighting position at the target location for free. It's free. You don't have to pay for it. Usually fighting positions are 100 manpower. This one is free. So if you get your M3 to Vet 1, or better yet, if you're playing Armored Battle Group and you get Vet 1 for free, you can just start plopping these things up all over the map. And this is especially true in team games. Like, I think the cooldown is like 2 minutes or 3 minutes maybe, but like you can just lay these down. You can just fight with them you can fight in them with like your machine gun teams or your infantry because they get nice accuracy bonuses and defensive bonuses from being in them. Or you can upgrade them to mortar pits and machine gun pits. Obviously, you need a significant munition investment to do that, but the fact that the fortify position is a free ability on the M3 half track is really, really nice for building tempo. I've seen a lot of players in 1v1 context especially, but I'm sure you can do this in team games as well, build like 2 M3s with Armored Battle Group where you're getting access to the early Vet 1, and then just building like 2 or 4 of these free fortify positions and converting them into like mortar pits. And your opponent has to commit like all these munitions or all these resources and troops and like push into them to attack them, because if they don't, then they start to just get pushed off the map by mortars combined with all of your other troops. And you just get so much tempo from it. It's really, really strong. So the M3 in a very strong position overall. And then obviously the versatility and being able to convert it into these various options is also very nice. Now, the medical variant, as far as medical half-tracks go, I pretty much have nothing to say about this. Let's actually crack open the unit card and make sure I'm not missing anything. But I don't really think there's anything unique or really special about the medical M3. Where the hell is this thing? There it is. I don't think there's anything special on it. Yeah, salvage crew, advanced medical crew. This is kind of nice, you know, advanced healing, like extra healing rate, the speed at which your troops heal on the field. This is kind of nice. But overall, like, you know, nothing really extra special about this particular variant. I usually argue that, like, if you're playing a team game, it's much more natural for a UK player to get their medical truck because it's a little bit cheaper. than for the American player to get theirs. But you can absolutely do this and make good use of it. You can build really excellent tempo throughout the game. And then obviously if you're playing the heavy weapon battle group and you have the conversion kits, there is always a place and a time for converting one of your half-tracks to a medical variant that you can use to replenish your forces on the front line. Next, we've got the motor pool. So the motor pool, as a building category, it's not in a great spot. When you combine the fuel required for the support centers and then add the motor pool cost on top of that, and then you add on top of that the cost of the motor pool light vehicles, it becomes a very expensive, a very expensive tech structure. And the issue with this is usually that if you're playing Rifleman, you don't really have the resources to invest in your Rifleman with your fuel, as well as light vehicles from motor pool, and then have like a good timed transition into tier 4 late game. And this is kind of like the crux of what makes motor pool difficult to use. Now, when you're using it with armored, that's kind of all that, like everything changes completely, and we'll talk about why when we get there. But the motor pool itself, like I haven't been using as much in my games. I have been using a lot more barracks into weapon support center. Weapon support center is a lot cheaper. The half tracks are a lot cheaper, and they also provide some of the same tools and capabilities within motor pool, just not quite as good. And that allows me the fuel to invest more in my Riflemen to help them scale. But as far as the motor pool goes itself, the M1 is actually, as far as AT guns go, this one is definitely strong. The reason why it's strong is mainly has to do with the access to the special AP rounds. It's the no, I don't think it is. I think it's actually a, I don't think it's a Veterancy ability. I think it's just, not this one. It was the other one. Oh, it's not showing it. Okay. The M1 has a special ability. I think it's like AP rounds that increases the damage and penetration. In that context, the M1 is very good. The Veterancy abilities on it are okay. I mean, for the most part, like Focus Sight isn't really that good because you should be having other units to scout for this anyways. As far as the rate of fire goes on this one, it has a same rate of fire as the 6-pounder. Both of the American and the UK AT guns have a slightly faster rate of fire than the German packs do. I think it's like 1 extra RPM at each range. So that's kind of nice. And then Brace can be nice too, especially if you are playing against an opponent that has a Stuka, because Brace will pretty much negate the damage and remove the possibility that you're going to get wiped by artillery. So I personally, like, I've been using Brace a lot more recently than Focus Sight as my Veterancy option. And then, of course, access to the triggerable AP rounds. I think they're a little bit expensive, but it's usually worthwhile against some of the heavier Axis armor. As far as AT guns go, this one is pretty strong. The Greyhound. The Greyhound... The Greyhound tends to waffle between OP and average, and it has everything to do with the scatter on the main cannon. I swear there's some players that try to use this unit and just have absolutely no luck with it, and there's other players that use it and it's just like the apex predator of killing infantry. It's crazy. But obviously, I mean, as far as the Greyhound goes itself, I'm putting it in average because of a couple reasons. Number one, it requires a pretty massive munitions investment to reach its like potential. You almost must buy the top-mounted or the pintle-mounted 50 caliber machine gun to deal consistent damage compared to the main cannon. And you pretty much need skirts to make sure that you're not losing this to one AT gun and a snare. There's a very good probability that that can happen if you don't buy skirts. And so skirts obviously increases the health of the Greyhound by 120, if I'm not mistaken. Taking it from 360 to 480, turning it into a very beefy light vehicle. And how you want to use this unit is it's just like a very mobile DPS machine. Think of it as like a heavier version of the Humber. It's probably like related to the Stuart. You could probably say that the Stuart and the Greyhound are kind of like cousins. The Greyhound is much better at dealing with infantry than the Stuart is, generally speaking. But the Stuart has some really nice utility and utility, and then some abilities that help it scale as well, like mark target, that allow it to provide some value in the late game. Whereas the Greyhound, most of its value comes from harassing troops on the outskirts of the map. And personally, I actually think the Raider passive is the best part of it. Let me pull up the unit card so you guys can see what I'm talking about. So Raider is my favorite Vet 1 ability because it allows you to very quickly decapture enemy territory. This isn't always, like it's not like the Jeep where you can like capture the territory and actually convert it into a resource advantage, but being constantly in your opponent's face on the outsides of the map, harassing their units that are isolated and then decapturing their territory is a great way to build the economic advantage that you need to pay off for the Greyhound. In addition, the Greyhound itself, once it's got its skirts and the 50 caliber, it's very formidable against things like the mid-game light vehicles like the Flak Vierling and the 8-Rad, as well as the 251 variants. The Greyhound is more than capable of dealing with those, but once some of the heavier mid-game vehicles start to come out, like the Stug variants, the Whirlwind, the Greyhound, the main cannon on it can't really consistently penetrate any of those, so you want to continue to focus on using it on infantry in general. In the right hands, this unit is probably strong, and I'd say even for some players, like they've gotten so good with it that they can push it up into the OP category. But I would say, like, generally speaking, and also taking team games into consideration here, where you may not have as much space to do a lot of flanking with the Greyhound, this is probably just an average unit. That takes me to the Chaffee. Now, the Chaffee with Armored Battlegroup is borderline a different unit. It's just better. But as far as this unit goes, it is strong, but only in a very specific context, from what I have seen. There are two ways to most effectively use the Chaffee. The first one is using what I call, and I think what you'll probably hear from the community, is the shock value. To define shock value, what it means is the shock value is the value of a unit when it is first revealed on the map to your opponent, which means it's the time at which, like, the first time that your opponent encounters this, any unit is considered like the shock timing. And what they're not able to do is, like, they're not going to be completely prepared to deal with it every time. Sometimes you'll come across like really conservative players that are totally ready for this. But essentially what I'm getting at here is that unless you have built a Greyhound, there's no way for your opponent to know that a Chaffee could potentially be coming. And that's where the power of the Chaffee comes in. I played against a player recently that did this really well. He did an airborne-based composition, starting in the early game with paradropped MGs into Paratroopers. Didn't have any vehicles that I could see. He converted that into, and I went for like Flak Vierling and a couple other things, and then he just went straight into a Chaffee, and I was completely unprepared, and he just ran over all my vehicles. I was playing DAC. He killed my Flak Vierling, he killed my 250, he just chased everything down and killed it. So that is the first context in which the Chaffee is super useful, is making sure that like you're being very decisive and committing to getting kills with it that are going to pay off. Best case, like you don't have to trade it out. But oftentimes if you have to trade it out for a high priority vehicle like a Flak Veerling, a Whirlwind, something that's a little bit more expensive, it can be worthwhile. But that is the first context. The second context is you're already playing a motor pool build and you're getting kind of concerned about your opponent's capabilities to transition into tier 4 heavier vehicles. The Chaffee can be good with numbers. It's very much like the Crusader in that way. There's a pretty famous clip. I'll try to link it in the description. There's a pretty famous clip of how these were used in combination with Armored Battlegroup a few patches ago. You could build like, I don't know, between 5 and 7 of these and pretty much just drive at your opponent and win. There is still some truth to that to an extent. You can still build, like, as long as you have a volume of these, they are very fast. And if they can get to the rear armor of any vehicle, which they can because they're so quick, they will be able to kill it because they have standard tank damage. They deal 120 damage on penetrating hits. The area where they struggle is if they don't have the element of surprise, the numerical advantage, or you haven't set up a proper flank where you can adequately get behind your opponent's vehicles and kill them that way. So either using this with shock value, basically like being really decisive about trying to pick off your opponent's priority units when this hits the field, or you're amassing a few of them and then finding an opportunity for an opening on a big all-in commit. That is the best way to use the Chafees. That takes us to the M3 variants. Now, these are also available from the motor pool to construct if you've gone for Mechanized Support Center, but you can also upgrade your M3 Halftrack into both of these variants along with the medical one. We'll start with the Quad. The Quad, for what it does, is strong. That might surprise a lot of people. But I think where a lot of the confusion comes in with how to use the Quad has to do with inexperience more than anything. So I'm going to show you guys something about the Quad. Where is it? No, let's do Quad Halftrack. Personnel, M3, where is it? Quad. Multiple, there, sorry. It's called the M16 Multiple Gun Motor Carriage. So, the M16, what I wanted to show you guys, is it here? Here we go. This is what I wanted to show you. So, pay attention to this, okay? Moving accuracy multiplier is 0.25, okay? If we compare this to most other infantry, weapons, etc., like look at Rifleman, okay? Rifleman moving accuracy is 0.75. That means it's 75% of what it would be when they're standing still. The M16 is 0.25, so it's 25% accuracy when it's moving. What does this mean? This means that in order to get the most out of the M16, we have to use it standing still, okay? That is the most important thing to do when you're using the M16. The M16 also has very high range. Where is it? Quad, there it is. That's why I got it confused. Now check this out. The Quad and the Flak Veerling, like, they do pretty equal damage to each other. And you'll notice, like, they also have even health. Now, I talk about this in my heavy weapons battlegroup how-to. But, like, the Quad is perfectly capable in the early game of trading with the Flak. They do approximately the same damage. Now, you'll notice, like, the Quad starts to drop off at range because of the extra armor. Or not the extra armor, but the lack of penetration from their guns. But I will tell you, like, when you combine this, for example, with like a Captain Mark target, for example, the quad is in a winning situation. Now, I will say, like, I'm not using the quad very much, except with the heavy weapons battle group and exchangeable parts, or if I'm expecting a lot of aircraft from my opponent. Like, for example, if my opponent is using Luftwaffe battle group, the quad might be a decent choice because you can provide some early game anti-infantry pressure, and then as the game progresses into the late game, you can focus on using it for AA purposes. And it also gets some really nice veterancy. At Vet 3, it gets an extra 33% damage, which really allows it to like burn down squads. So let me really quickly show you guys like the DPS difference between the quad and the Flak Vierling in the context of dealing with infantry specifically. So I'll put in here like just like a Rifleman squad. Like, you'll notice the Flak, it has AoE damage, which is going to add a lot to like what the potential is. But then if you compare it to the M16, don't want the DAC filter. You compare it to the M16. Look at the damage on the M16, dude. Look at this. Even at max range, like, this is better than like a line infantry unit at max range. And all you have to do, like, the quad has 45 range, which means you could just park this unit behind your line units and kind of attack, move it around in the back line, and it will still deal very respectable damage to your opponent's troops. If you're able to find a unit that is like isolated and has no access to snares, that's when you can get up and park in their face and completely chew them up. Because this damage is absolutely crazy. Like, for context, okay? Most infantry units have about between 80 and 100 health per squad member. So at 40 damage per second, that means I'm burning down a guy every 2.5 seconds. Which is absolutely crazy, and it only gets better with veterancy. So, quad, highly slept on unit. It does have like a limited window of usefulness, of course, because it can't deal damage to some of the heavier light vehicles. But in the early game for anti-infantry purposes, and then thinking about how you can scale it into an anti-aircraft role in the late game, it's not a bad unit by any means. And you combine that with the fact that the M3 timing is very good, you can get some great tempo with this, specifically when you're using it for armored battle group. One of my favorite things to do heavy weapons. One of my favorite things to do with heavy weapons has been, I do my Rifleman build, then I go into my heavy weapon battle group. I get the exchangeable parts option, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It basically allows you to convert your Halftracks from one to another for free. So what I do is I build an M3, I go for the quad first, and then when my opponent gets a heavier vehicle out, then I convert it into the gun motor carriage, the 75mm. So it's a very good unit. Very good unit, even better with exchangeable parts. That takes us to the gun motor carriage. This unit is OP, dude. This unit is so good. It has so much value at every stage of the game. I had a game yesterday that I'll probably upload to YouTube at some point, where I had one gun motor carriage in a 36-minute game that killed 4 Panzer IVs by itself. Obviously had some help from like my Rifleman and snares and other things, but like I only had one of these and I was just doing some crazy work on Panzer IVs. So what makes this thing so good? Couple things. First, where is it? Let's find the gun motor carriage. Here you are, my sweet baby. So, couple things that make this insanely good. First is the high explosive barrage. I mean, this is basically like a mortar substitute. And if you get a couple of these things, like, you can apply some crazy pressure to your opponent's defensive positions or team weapons from way out of range. Like, they cannot retaliate to this unless they dive you with some kind of vehicle. So the high explosive barrage, super low cooldown as well, and great for softening up your opponent. Think of this as, like, I talked about the synergy between the Stummel and the Panzer Grenadiers in my last video. The high explosive barrage from the GMC and Rifleman have the same synergistic relationship, where you can use the high explosive barrage to soften up your enemy and then close in with your Rifleman to get the kills. Like I said, super short cooldown, which makes it really useful. And then, of course, the fact that this is an anti-tank unit that can penetrate pretty much any vehicle, except for the super late ones. The super late game vehicles, it has a harder time punching through. But if you've kept it alive from the beginning of the game, then got it to Vet 3, I mean, the extra range, the extra damage, rate of fire bonuses, like, this thing is going to be fine. The other nice things about the Halftrack, it's really fast. So it is able to kind of like escape from or handle vehicle dives from your opponent. And then access specifically, so you have 2 veterancy options when it comes to the M3. I'm going to be straight with you guys. Never use First Strike. Never use First Strike. It's not worth it. I mean, it's fine, but like, target weak point is just infinitely better. Like, this ability combined with this ability is really what puts this unit from like average right up into OP, because this ability, so just so you guys know, you can see it says greatly improves weapon penetration, but I'm pretty sure this is a guaranteed penetration. Vehicles hit by the unit have reduced speed and disabled weapons for a short period of time. That short period of time is 5 seconds. Which basically is the difference between being able to get another shot in and getting killed by whatever's diving you. It's also very cheap and is a great way to set up like a combination snare from an infantry squad. So you lead with target weak point, and then like you bring in your Rifleman, you sprint in, you throw an anti-tank grenade at it, and then you're able to just kind of like stay at a distance with the GMC and finish it off, right? Finish off whatever vehicle that is. I've got countless vehicle kills, medium, light vehicles, whatever it is, between Rifleman and GMC by executing this strategy. So target weak point is amazing also because it allows you a self-peel ability to prevent dives from your opponent. So if you're, on the defensive, maybe your opponent is like driving in at you with an 8-rad or something, you're kind of caught out of position. Using target weak point will give you the opportunity to create extra space and bring in other units to support while your GMC is backing away. So this is just an exceptional ability. I would always get this as your Vet 1 choice between these two. And that is frankly, between the barrage, target weak point, and the consistency and strong penetration of this vehicle, this is an OP vehicle easily. Sherman. As far as medium tanks go, by the way, we're in tier 4 now, so that's it for motor pool. Moving into tier 4, we'll talk about the base Sherman first, and then we'll talk about the 76mm variant. So the base Sherman, I'm putting in the average category. Prior to the 2.0 patch, I would have put this vehicle in strong, but due to the machine gun buffs on all the tanks across the board, not just the M4, and the rework to the veterancy abilities of the German P3s and P4s, this has dropped from a strong tank to an average tank. Still a very capable anti-infantry option and very capable at dueling P3s and P4s, but generally like upgraded P3s and P4s have the advantage over the Sherman. The Sherman has stronger frontal armor, but both, well, actually, no, I don't know if the P3 does. The P3 versus the Sherman is actually probably about 50-50, but P4 versus the Sherman is definitely leaning now towards the P4, just because of the changes that it's got over the last several patches. The main difference in the dynamic now versus before is that the P4 had its rate of fire increased a while ago, and the Sherman did not get the same buff. And then most recently, with the Vet 1 changes to the P4, you now have the ability to push that reload rate or that rate of fire even further, which means even though the Sherman has slightly stronger frontal armor than the P4 and has higher probability to bounce shots from the front, the P4 has a high enough rate of fire that it can still probably outduel the Sherman in a 1v1 situation. The upsides of the Sherman, it still has it has a ton of great machine guns on it, which make it a great, very reliable anti-infantry choice. If you're looking for dedicated anti-infantry, the Bulldozer is definitely better. But the Sherman is still a very strong, strong. It is an average generalist. It does exactly what you would expect a medium tank to do, with really nothing super special to write home about. When it comes to its capabilities. Both veterancy options are pretty viable. I think the white phosphorus is the more competitive choice. Here, let me pull it up for you guys so you can see. M4, there we go. So you have two veterancy options. You have Keep Them Firing, which gives you a significant buff to your machine guns. The major drawback of this is the minus 33% speed. It can kind of put you in a dicey sort of circumstance. But the burst length on the machine guns really allows you to chew through targets, especially those that are in the open. Using this against Jaeger blobs, if you have improvised armor upgrades, is really good. It's really solid. White phosphorus is the more competitive choice, because it's a great self-peel option. It's kind of like a get-out-of-jail-free card, and it can also be used on the offensive to disable your opponent's weapons and try to force an engagement or to disengage them. And this is used only against vehicles. So like I said, this is a more competitive choice, but if you're dealing with a lot of infantry, I think, honestly, I think this choice is a little bit more fun. But the white phosphorus is probably more competitive overall. So that takes us to the 76mm variant. Now, the 76mm, on the other hand, is in the strong category. The major difference between the standard M4 Sherman and the 76mm variant, by the way, in case those of you that don't know, the way that you get the 76mm is through an upgrade to the armory. It's the Mechanized Support Center upgrade, which we'll talk about it near the end of the video when I talk about the support centers. So here's the Sherman versus the 76mm. I want you guys to pay close attention to the main guns, because the main guns are different. So the standard Sherman, you can see it fires 9 RPM, has penetration of 140, 125, 110 from near to far range, so kind of lower penetration. And then if you look at the AoE radius, you can see that it's 4.5. Okay? Now, comparing that to the 76mm variant, this is kind of the fundamental difference. You'll notice the penetration on the 76mm is much higher than the standard M4. It's almost 50% higher. No, wait, is that right? Yeah, it's about 50% more penetration on the 76mm variant. I'm actually noticing that the AoE radiuses apparently are the same, but the 76mm definitely does more area of effect damage. You actually can't see it reflected here in the charts or any of the stats, but basically the damage drop off in the area of effect is better on the 76mm Sherman, meaning it will do more damage to units that are further away from the area of impact than the base Sherman will. Okay? So basically what that means is this gun is just categorically better against infantry and against vehicles. I've been experimenting with some kind of cheeky upgrades with this. I actually have an interesting 2v2 game on Campbell's Convoy where I went for whiz bangs and then I went for the 76mm conversion. And when you jettison the rocket launcher on the whiz bang, if you have the upgrade, it will now convert into a 76mm Sherman, which is pretty nice. So anyway, small, not a huge difference, but basically, like, as you would expect, as is the upgrade, it's just a main gun upgrade for the Sherman to make it more competitive late game vehicle, late game vehicle choice. Hellcat. The Hellcat is in a pretty good spot. I think, I know like some people feel like the Hellcat has a bit of an identity crisis because they can't really tell if it's supposed to be like a diving anti-tank vehicle or like a longer range anti-tank vehicle. The core difference between the Hellcat and the other tank destroyers in the game is, first of all, the Hellcat has a turret and is much more maneuverable. It's much faster. It does have a lower rate of fire, which is probably like the main drawback of it. It's actually what probably puts the Hellcat into the average vehicle category rather than strong. However, like, there are some things that will put it in the strong category, such as access to HVAP. But when I compare it to the other American vehicles, I mean, this is I'd say this is on like the bottom side of the strong tier. Because it's still a very capable tank destroyer, but the main drawbacks are, as you guys know, it has less range than the casemate tank destroyers. So I'll crack open, we'll compare it to a Mortar here really quickly. We'll do the Hellcat against the Mortar. So you can see the Mortar has 50 range and the Hellcat only has 45. So what this means for the Hellcat is that you need to be closer to the target, which puts you in a little bit more danger. But you also, you notice like you have a significantly larger health pool for the Hellcat compared to the Mortars. So you're using this effectively. The effective way to use these is properly screening for them with your infantry, zooming in, taking a pot shot, and then deciding, okay, am I going to pursue based on how many shots penetrated / landed on the target? Or am I going to back away? Those are kind of your two choices. With Mortars and other tank destroyers, you're not usually making that decision. They're much more static weapons. You can't be quite as responsive in the way that you use them, or reactive, I guess you could say. And so that's kind of the core thing that differentiates the Hellcat. I think both passives on it are quite good. Both, not passives. Both veterancy upgrades on it are quite good. Let's pull up the unit card here. So you have access to shoot and scoot. This actually hasn't been updated. Shoot and scoot got some significant buffs that made the speed increase and the acceleration increase much better. This is what allows you to engage in that behavior that I described, where basically you screen with your infantry, attack move your Hellcats in and have them take a pot shot from max range. And then you can kind of decide, like, am I going to commit maybe with HVAP? Or am I going to kind of like continue to kind of inch my way in and try to take pot shots so that I can get to the point where I can decide whether I'm going to commit with an all-in? The Hellcats have the speed and acceleration to catch up to a lot of the German tanks, so it becomes very difficult for them to outrun them if you manage to get some good opening blows. Obviously, the Hellcat also has access to HVAP as the secondary option, and this is really good. It provides an extra 25% damage, 50% penetration. This is going to provide you much more consistent and dependable damage against some of the heavier German tank variants like the KT, the Panther, or the Tiger. And I would say, banking some munitions for the use of these on a big push with Hellcats is probably worth your while. That takes us to the Bulldozer. Bulldozer, also a strong unit. Very, very good AoE profile, good frontal armor, a little bit of nice utility in the kind of like the minesweeper capabilities of the Bulldozer on the front of the Sherman. The fact that it has a rotating turret is something that differentiates it a little bit from the Brumbar. Let's do a little bit of a side-by-side so you guys can see the comparison. Oops, let's do Bulldozer and the Brumbar. Side by side, so we've got the Brumbar. You can see the Brumbar has a lot more frontal armor than the Sherman does. Actually, not a lot, but like it has more. It's got 60 more armor, which is pretty good. The Bulldozer, very decent, like much better frontal armor than the standard Sherman variant. It also has a bigger health pool, you'll notice. The standard Sherman has 720, the Bulldozer has 840. And then you combine that with some of the machine gun buffs that the tanks got in the most recent patch. The Bulldozer is a great anti-infantry and anti-blob option. I'd say like Bulldozers, if you're fighting against an opponent that's using like a lot of Jaegers, for example, with Panzerschrecks, the Bulldozer is a great option to deal with them because of the high frontal armor. And if you're playing team games and you can get away with Mechanized Support Center with improvised armor upgrade, the Bulldozer can be super nice because it becomes really, really beefy against handheld AT weapons. So this is a totally dependable, consistent, strong choice, I would say, for the American Tier 4 as kind of like the Brumbar counterpart. Main advantages of this are that the gun has a higher range than the Brumbar does. And obviously having a turret makes it a lot more maneuverable, easier to hit targets than the Brumbar, which has to face its target directly. The Brumbar definitely has a much better AoE profile. You can see here it's got an AoE radius of 7. And the Bulldozer Sherman has an AoE radius of 6. But it still does a very solid amount of damage to infantry anywhere within the radius of the projectile landing. So that takes us to our structures. Really quickly, we talked about the mortar. I think the mortar pit specifically is strong. It is very possible to like get on top of these and destroy them, which is why I'm not going to put it in the OP tier. But I mean, everything that's great about the mortar is great about the mortar pit. So I'm not going to reiterate too much. And again, you know, what makes this really nice now is the new Vet 1 from the M3 Halftrack. The ability to build these fighting pits for free and then spend some munitions to upgrade them into mortar pits is, it should be interesting to see how more of this comes up over the course of team games, potentially. Now, as far as fortifications go on machine gun nests, I mean, this thing is fine. You know, it's very capable at what it does. It's relatively cheap compared to some of the alternatives, but it is also a little bit more fragile if you compare it, for example, to like one of the Wehrmacht's concrete bunkers. But not bad for locking down an area if you have a good chunk of munitions and some manpower to spend to cover like a flank or you know, position on a very lightly contested VP. I've done that from time to time. This is a fine option. So that takes us to the end of the standard American tech tree. I'm going to go into the battle groups next, and then we're going to finish with the support centers. Sorry, I just need a drink because I've been yapping. All right. Hour and a half, we're still going strong. Here we go. So, heavy weapon battle group. Let's bust open the battle group itself so we can see everything together. So you've got two trees. You've got the weapon teams tree and cavalry support tree. I think this is a really strong battle group. The main weaknesses in this battle group are that it doesn't really have anything for like the mid game. The way that I use this, there's a couple different like options. Basically, how I'm opening most games when I'm planning to use this battle group, and I'll link my my how-to heavy weapon battle group in the description. If you haven't seen that, go check it out, because I break down everything in a lot more detail. But overall, like, I feel like this battle group has a lot of fantastic tools for team weapons, and between the Pershing and the M5 anti-tank gun, there are some great late game units and options. And then all of the abilities in it are quite strong as well. Gallant Stand is very good. Rapid Reposition. Assault Carriers, I haven't used. Honestly, I have not used these a lot. I just feel like using these for the purpose of trying to get up in your opponent's face, you're kind of just asking to lose the half-track, and I don't really like using them for that. So I tend to convert these. I don't ever really use them as the assault variant. But the ability to then get access to exchangeable parts, this, in my opinion, is one of the strongest components of the battle group. And like I mentioned, it's just because of the versatility of being able to switch between different half-track variants as you need to throughout the game is really, really nice. So what that can look like is, like, oftentimes, if I'm doing a Rifleman-based composition and then pivoting into a Tier 2 and building an M3, by that time I've usually got the 2 CP that I need to get access to exchangeable parts. This means that when my M3 comes out, I can convert it to one of the variants of my choosing right away. And by right away, I mean, like, the upgrade takes 8 seconds, because that's one of the benefits of exchangeable parts, is an 8-second conversion period. So usually what I've been doing is, like, I'll build my M3, I'll convert it to, like, a quad for super early game anti-infantry pressure and a little bit of, like, anti-light vehicle pressure. By the way, the quad is amazing at, like, chewing through the 250, for example. If you keep the quad stationary and a 250 is driving it, it's in my how-to for the heavy weapons battle group, it just completely chews through it without any issues. And that's including, like, having a Panzerjäger in it as well. So the quad, really, really nice. And then, once my opponent gets their first light vehicle out, like a Flak Vierling or something else, then I'm more than happy to convert it into the GMC. Sometimes in team games, or, like, depending on how many vehicles we're facing from our opponents, I'll get a second GMC, so I have 2. That kind of support each other. Both hopefully they get access to target weak point. You can kind of chain those into each other to chain stun a vehicle, get really nice kills that way. And then, if you for example, if you neutralize the vehicle threat, then maybe you decide you want to convert one of your GMCs into a frontline medical truck to, reinforce your troops on the front line and give them heals and, that sort of thing. Or maybe you want to convert it into an assault carrier so that you can transport troops. The world is kind of your oyster, because all of the variants of half-track are very usable and very... they have lots of utility, depending on what you're going for. I mean, you guys will notice, like, the only half-track that I put in average was the medical variant. That's not really surprising. There's lots of strong American half-track variants that you can use. I'll be honest, half-track strong points I haven't used because exchangeable parts is just so good. This might be good if you're planning to use the M5, the 3-inch anti-tank gun. The extra, weapon range accuracy can probably be pretty nice. Combine that with the 50 caliber teams that you get access to later or earlier. Then I can see this being pretty useful if you're using, like, a medical half-track on the front line. But I generally have been using exchangeable parts more because it gives me more versatility within my build over the course of a longer game. The Pershing and the M5. The M5 is really solid. It's got a little bit lower penetration than, like, the 17-pounder, for example, but it still has very high damage. It also has the ability to fire an artillery barrage for a price. So you can kind of use this as, like, a light artillery piece as well. And it must be towed, similar to the other towable anti-tank guns like the 88 and the 17-pounder. Yeah, I mean, I think, calling these in with the M3, my main concern with them has been like they are, like most anti-tank guns, they are very susceptible to barrages from a lot of like late game artillery, like the Wesp, like the Stuka, the Nebelwerfer. So that's kind of the main issue with these. But if you're super responsive and you're playing a little bit more defensively, and then you get access to some of these bonuses like Gallant Stand, bolstered team weapons, maybe you're using half-track strong points, a lot of the stacking buffs can make this thing an absolute menace. And if you have two of them, then even better. But generally speaking, I have to say the Pershing is the GOAT. The Pershing is hands down, bar none, the best tank in the game, period. It is the best individual tank in the entire game, hands down. I'm going to crack open the unit card and we'll talk about why. So, first of all, this thing is crazy fast. Here, let's do a comparison. Let me get, is it going to show me the speed? Yeah, it is. It is going to show me the speed. Let's compare it to a Crusader, actually. I'm really curious about this. The Crusader's got to be super close. Might be better. Let's compare the Pershing and the Crusader. Okay, yeah, so the Crusader is faster. The Crusader is definitely faster than the Pershing. But as far as heavy tanks go, I mean, the Pershing is hands down like the fastest by far. You compare it to like a Panzer IV, for example, which is considered one of the more maneuverable German tanks. You can see like Pershing significantly faster, about 15% faster than the P4. Much better acceleration and deceleration, as you can see here as well. And then the Pershing has really exceptional frontal armor. And then the 90mm gun on it, just super high penetration, very good probability of penetrating most vehicles from the front. And that includes the Tiger and the King Tiger, but obviously the closer you get, the more likely you are. But I say like the secret to using the Pershing is not slogging it out frontal armor with the Tiger or the King Tiger. It's using the speed and maneuverability to access the flanks, hitting them in the side, and using the superior rate of fire on the Pershing to take out your targets. Let me switch over to the Tiger here just for a more direct comparison. So you can see here, like the Tiger's 88mm, it has a slightly lower rate of fire than the Pershing does. The Pershing also has superior penetration than the Tiger. Now the Tiger's much better at taking out infantry. It has a much more broad, it has a much lower damage drop off for its anti-infantry profile. But the Pershing does good anti-infantry damage as well. They're both very good at it. But yeah, man, like the the Pershing's speed and its maneuverability combined with its high rate of fire for a heavy tank, and then you stack on top of that access to this, the HVAP shot with the precision strike. This allows you to disable. It's basically target weak point. Is basically what this is. The Pershing has access to its own version of target weak point, which disables enemy weapons, reduces their speed and acceleration for 5 seconds. This allows it to duel any tank in the game easily. And using precision shot, because it's so cheap, you can use this to like set up some really easy kills on your opponent's mediums and heavies. So I'm using this, I'm basically spamming this HVAP shot, trying to pick off isolated tanks that my opponent has, or low tanks, and using the maneuverability to zoom in and zoom out of unfavorable engagements or engagements where I've taken a lot of damage, sorry. The other thing about the Pershing, I don't know why this is, I'm going to be honest. I think, okay, let me just confirm that this is true, because I was skeptical that when someone said this to me. Yeah, okay. Okay, so I want you guys to pay attention to something else. Look at the difference in veterancy requirements between the Tiger and the Pershing, okay? The Pershing requires like almost 50%, 35-ish% less XP over the Tiger, which means it's getting to Vet 3 like crazy fast. Crazy fast. Like, I can get this thing to Vet 3 in like less than 6 minutes if I'm using it super, super actively. And the veterancy bonuses on it are absolutely crazy. Like getting, 40% rate of fire bonus at Vet 3, extra speed, rotation rate. Like, this thing is an absolute monster at Vet 3. So it scales with it scales into its veterancy much more quickly than the Tiger. And for that reason, again, that just pushes this tank way up into the S tier. We didn't talk about the 50 calibers. Let me go back here. Sorry, we got a little sidetracked. So looking at the weapon teams, just so you guys know, the 50 caliber is basically just a straight up across the board upgrade to the 30 cal. It has higher damage, higher penetration, and better suppression power. That's really, really all you need to know about this. The 30 cal, like I mentioned, already quite strong. And I also said the MG42 is the best machine gun in the game. I think this one might be better. That's probably up for a debate a little bit, but I'm pretty sure like the 50 caliber is the best machine gun. On top of that, you've got these two abilities, Gallant Stand, Rapid Reposition. They're both valuable. I think that like if you're planning on using Gallant Stand, you should probably only be using that with the M5. Generally, if I'm playing with Pershing, I'm using Rapid Reposition so I can be super, super active with my 50 calibers. And I'm not usually having other team weapons outside of that, but obviously, the utility of the speed that you get from these troops is very good. And I would also say, like, if you're playing heavy team weapons in a team game, Rapid Reposition might be better because you can be more responsive to like traversing the map and helping out your teammates with your team weapons in the ways that you choose to. If you're playing a heavy weapon support center into motor pool build and then finishing your build with a Pershing, this is a great option for you to use with your machine gun teams and your AT guns. Between bolster team weapons and Black Dragon, I mean, the choice is really yours. Both of these are very useful. Black Dragon is just a really big, like, Giga Barrage, kind of similar to Zeroing Artillery and many of the other large caliber barrage abilities in the game. And bolster team weapons, if you're playing team weapon heavy, is probably a better choice overall because this 20% rate of fire that you get is really, really nice for the any AT gun variant as well as the 50 calibers. It makes them much stronger as well. So overall, this battle group, I am putting it in OP. I think some people might have feelings about this and say like, it is not, I'll say this, it's not the most OP, but it is very strong. It is probably, in my opinion, and we'll get to this at the end, we'll stack rank these at the end. It is probably the second strongest battle group for US forces at the moment. In my opinion. So bringing in all the other units, 50 caliber, I mean, if 30 cal, 50 caliber has to be as well. The armored carrier half-track, I'll put this in strong alongside the M3. I mean, it's really just the M3, but better. Quick note about this. A lot of people didn't know this, but this open top version has more health than the standard M3 and more health than all of the other half-tracks as well. Let me crack open the unit card so you guys can see. M3, no, not going to do that for me, are you? Half-track, we need the assault carrier. Here it is. So you can see the assault carrier has 400 health. US, GMC, no, quad. No. Come on now. There we go. Sorry about that. You can see here, it has 80 more health than the other half-track variants. which really helps it fit into that like purpose-built diving angle that you're trying to use on this half-track, or assault. I mean, hence the assault name, I guess you could say. So it's really just like a better version of the base M3. But what you are missing out on is this doesn't have the fortified position ability. So just keep that in mind. If you convert your half-tracks from the standard M3 and you wanted to use the Vet 1 for the free pits, the free fighting pits, you cannot get that from the assault half-track variant. M5 AT gun, I mean, as far as heavy AT guns go, I actually would put this in average. I think the 88 is probably better. And the 17 pounder has more penetration. So this thing is decent. It fulfills the role of a heavy AT gun, but there's nothing like super exceptional about it that would push it into the high tier categories. But I do think that these can be like pretty dangerous when used in pairs in a team game setting. But just keeping in mind, like, you just have to be really wary of your opponent's artillery options, because that could put an end to using these very quickly. The Pershing is the best heavy tank in the game. It's the best tank in the game, period. So, of course, this is going to go in the OP category. I mean, you stack the veterancy requirements being super low on top of everything else that we talked about. And this thing is like like ridiculously OP from my perspective. Next, we're going into special operations. So I've been having a lot of fun with this battle group recently. I think it has a lot of really nice, unique options that complements a lot of the things inside the American roster. And there's a lot of really fun units in it. So starting out, we'll start with the left-hand side. So the Weasel Recon Combat Vehicle, and we've got the Weasel with the M1 Pack Howitzer. I'm usually going for this option, number one, because the Pack Howitzer is trash. It's actually complete garbage. Please don't build it. It's a complete waste of resources. A M1 Mortar is infinitely better than this. Don't build it right now. It needs to be buffed. It's terrible. But the M29 you get right at 0 CP, so you can call it in right at the beginning of the game, which is really nice. You can just rip it out on the map and start capturing territory. The 30 caliber upgrade on it is really nice. I want to compare it actually side by side to the Jeep, so you guys can see the difference. Oops. Oh, it's 4x4, isn't it? Yep. So you'll see actually. Is that true? No, that can't be true. I could have sworn. Oh, you know what it is? It's because of armor. Sorry, let me compare these differently. Sorry about that. So let's compare to shooting at a Rifleman squad, okay? So you can see the 4x4 or the Jeep has about 6 damage at range, long range. And I believe, unless I made a mistake and they changed it. No, yeah. So the Weasel has better damage against infantry, both at short range and at long range. It also has a little bit more armor than the Jeep and a little bit more health. This is great to use as like a fire support platform, especially in the early game. And again, you're really trying to use the Weasel's main gun, to the upgraded 30 caliber, to chip away at your opponent. Create weaknesses for your riflemen to capitalize on, or whatever else you use. You can do a weapon support center build with this thing too. It's also very good. And then as far as the veterancy options go on the Weasel, you've got signal layer and medical station. I'll say like signal layer is probably better choice if you manage to get pushed off the map and are making your way back on, because you'll actually get the benefits of signal layer. If you're having a really strong early game, and I would say honestly more in general, having frontline medical is really, really nice. It's some of the core value that comes with like the Dingo for the UK's roster. But access to a medical station on the front line, especially with your riflemen or other units that are going to be taking a whole bunch of chip damage throughout the early game, the medical station really helps keep you topped up and keeps you from taking losses. So So prioritizing in the early game with your Weasel, capturing a little bit of territory, getting that machine gun upgrade, and then getting in the face of your opponent and dealing damage so you can get access to that Vet 1. It also has the ability to drop weapons exactly the same as the Jeep, which is really nice. So I'm not going to talk about that too much because I know you guys have heard me yap about that enough. This is a great vehicle. It's great in the early game. It fantastically complements especially like a weapons support center build, because you have now an early game mobile option with good DPS that can be responsive, while your machine guns and scouts are used for like slowly creeping up and locking down territory. Going back into the group here. So yeah, I would bypass this. Like, this is never worth getting. It's very expensive, and the pack howitzer is an artillery unit is just trash right now. It doesn't do enough damage, and eventually you're pretty much guaranteed to get chewed up by late game artillery. So it just turns out to be a pretty big waste. Next, you have the P-47 anti-infantry loiter. This is still excellent as far as loiters go. A lot of the loiters got nerfed, but this one is still very good. Now, I will say that I've been wary to use either of these options because the anti-aircraft weapons for Axis have become very meta recently. And by that, I mean the 20mm flak, the 2cm flak, the Wirbelwind, and the flak Vierling are all pretty much very common units to see in every single game. And so honestly, like, using these kind of turns out to be a big waste of resources. However, if your opponent is like playing tier 3 Wehrmacht or something and they're not building a lot of anti-aircraft, then this can be very, very good. Generally, I'm going for the anti-infantry loiter over the marked vehicle. This is actually just a worse version of the captain ability. I mean, slightly worse. It gives a little bit more penetration, but it doesn't give the incoming damage. And it also takes a little while to fly in and get over top of the target and actually apply the debuff. It doesn't happen right away. Whereas with the captain, it's like once you're in range and it triggers, it's on like that. So I don't know, marked vehicle, I think it needs a little bit of a buff. Maybe just like the arrival time of the plane would make a big difference. But the captain ability is basically better. The only reason that I might consider going for this over the anti-infantry loiter at the moment is just so I can get to the whiz-bang faster. If I'm trying to go for the call-in variant over the producible one. On the other side of the tree, you've got raiding flares and smokescreen. Raiding flares are exceptional because they're relatively cheap and they reveal a large area and cannot be shot down like planes can. This has been really useful for me in games where I'm playing against a lot of cloaked units, especially like DAC, Battlefield Espionage Battle Group, or Terror Battle Group. Even, playing against like a heavy composition with like Jaegers or packs with cloak. Raiding flares is really, really excellent for that. The other option you have is smokescreen. This is decent too. It's a free ability with a decently long cooldown. I think it's about 3 minutes, that you can use to set up for attacks or use defensively. It arrives on target pretty quickly as well, which is nice. But in general, I lean more towards the raiding flares. That takes us to SSF Commandos. These guys are my favorite part of this battle group. The unit itself it has some really clear weaknesses, but if these guys can scale into like Vet 2, Vet 3, they become really strong, especially if you can get the upgraded Zooks on them from the Weapon Support Center. And then access to the special, they are special, detonator charges. Let me open up this unit so you guys can see. So they have access to hidden demolition charges, which means most demolition charges can be detected by any unit as long as they get close enough. But these ones can only be detected by minesweepers, which means you can place them in really cheeky positions or on roads, for example, to trigger some really fantastic ambushes or wipe enemy units. I have a game I'll link in the description recently that I played on Santuario, showcasing the how-to of how to use this battle group. Showcase the SSFs, showcase the whiz-bang, the flares, all the good stuff. You'll see it in that game, so I'll link that in the description. Taking us back to the tier list, I think this battle group at the moment is in the strong category. The Weasel is right up there next to the Jeep in terms of its strength. SSFs, I think, are very strong as well. The reason why they're not in the OP category is how late they arrive and their cost, I would say. But overall, like, the performance of the unit is very good. This thing is garbage. Never build it. It's a piece of junk. They really need to revert or fix, like, give the infantry support guns some kind of identity, because right now they're just like worse versions of mortars and have a little bit more range. Both the DAC version and the US version, as well as the UK version, they're all just bad. They're not very good right now, so I wouldn't recommend them. The Whiz-Bang, I'd like to see this be a little bit better. I'd say it's kind of at the bottom side of the strong category. You know, I almost want to put it in average. Like, as far as artillery goes, this is probably average. The weaknesses of the Whiz-Bang are it has very short range, and the rate of fire on it isn't great. And so even if you're like hitting a target, as long as your opponent retreats quickly, they're usually able to escape from this. If you compare it to like the Stuka can just outright weapons that are at full health, and this thing just can't do that. But it is really nice for hitting like big clumps of infantry, big clumps of team weapons, even vehicles. The game that I had on Campbell's Convoy, where I used this recently, I barraged a couple of Martyrs, then I jettisoned the launchers and dove in on the Martyrs to finish them off. So you can pull off some really neat plays with these things. But at the moment, like, as far as artillery goes, they need a little bit of help. They're not great, but they do kind of fill that artillery niche that the Americans kind of lack inside of their tech tree. So they're, you know, decent for that, I guess you could say. So overall, yeah, Spec Ops Battle Group and Strong, that's kind of the end of the Spec Ops tree there. Oh, sorry, I didn't finish the abilities. We stopped at SSF. So quickly, just to summarize the end tree here, I would say if you're going for the producible Whiz-Bang, go for air resupply operation, because it's going to give you a nice 40 fuel crate that is going to help you catapult your way into that tier 4. And then you get access to some nice mid-game support weapons through an 57mm anti-tank gun and the M1919 that can both be crewed. And this, again, will help you build some significant tempo, because the manpower cost to crew all of these weapons combined with the fuel is going to help you build your advantage into the mid game to help you scale into the late game and get access to your tier 4 stuff. Okay. Now, assault operation, I'm not going to say too much about. I think this ability is a little bit too expensive for what it does, to be honest. But it can come in very clutch in the late game. I think I would like to see some kind of like global speed buff attached to this. Maybe like a 10% speed buff. It doesn't have to be a lot, but it just feels like it's pretty expensive for basically decapture rate and harder to hit. I mean, when this comes out, the stage this comes out in the game, like, it harder to hit isn't really that much of an issue, as much as like getting AoE'd by vehicles and other units. So I think it's a little expensive, and for that reason I usually lean more into air resupply operation, and then I make my way down this tree. But you know, this is something that can come in clutch, especially in the late game. If you're like really trying to secure some VPs and it's very close, then this can be very good for that. Okay, that takes us into Advanced Infantry Battle Group. So let's close this out and open that up. Advanced Infantry, we've got Convert to Rangers, Artillery Observers, Ammunition Storage. Honestly, I probably should have put this into my as like a unit in the tier list, because this thing, honestly, I'm literally gonna do it right now. So please forgive me, guys. I'm gonna load this in like right now, right here. I'm gonna put this in the tier list because it's not a unit, but it's so valuable, like it has to go in here. This thing is OP, dude. like this thing as a support structure, I guess is the best way to describe it, is incredibly good. Let me crack it open so we can. Oh, it's actually not going to let me do it. Oh, actually, okay, it says here. Never mind, I don't need to crack it open. So you can see affected units gain 40% reload speed and 40% ability recharge speed. If you have any kind of artillery on your team and they are near this thing, they will be able to fire nonstop. And that also applies to the howitzer emplacement, which we'll talk about in a second. But like, I love putting this near a teammate that is going for like 2 bishops. Because man, they can just like, your teammate can do basically twice as much work. It could do the work of 4 bishops with 2, and the reload speed on it means that the rounds are going to arrive on target. There's going to be less gap in between shots, and it's going to leave your Axis opponents less time to react to barrages that are incoming. So this is super strong. It's so good. So good if you're using artillery. And better yet, if you can position it like kind of in a protected space, maybe closer to the front line. For example, if you have a teammate that's using the M5 AT guns or like the 17 pounder, parking this like just out of range behind one of them and giving them the access to the reload speed and ability recharge speed, so good, man. Like they will be able to chew through Axis armor like no tomorrow. So this thing, super good. Artillery observers, not bad as far as like a scout subunit goes. They lack rifle grenades, which makes them like not as good as well, actually, do they lack smoke too? No, they have smoke. I'm pretty sure they have smoke. Let's double check that. Yeah, they do have smoke. They do have smoke. They lack rifle grenades like the airborne Pathfinders. And they also have the ability to construct those little recon towers that drop artillery. I'm not a huge fan of those, honestly. I kind of feel like they're a waste of manpower for the most part. But as combat units, like these guys are decent. You kind of want to use them the same way that you would use airborne Pathfinders. Just keep them at super long range if possible. And then as far as veterancy options goes, I think the passive healing is probably the best choice. Best case scenario, you're taking engagements at max range and just taking a little bit of chip damage at a time. And the ability to heal at a combat is going to keep you from dropping models and having to go back to base or something to reinforce. Next, we've got the howitzer. I have mixed feelings about the howitzer. So I actually really like the howitzer's performance. The main problem with it right now is how easy it is to counter if you build it close to the front line, which is kind of what you want to do because of the access to the free fire drills at the moment. But just recently with like how the Wesp is performing, the Stuka, I honestly don't know if it's a problem with those artillery units. I kind of feel like I would like to see more artillery brought up to that power level, generally speaking. But the issue is that like the howitzer is very easy for those units to kill. So basically, if you're going to use the howitzer, you have to play really far back with it, like well out of range of a potential Wesp or Stuka barrage. Otherwise, you're pretty much guaranteed to lose it. I've seen a Stuka completely dismantle one of these in one barrage. And that means, when I say dismantle, I mean like decrew it and then finish the gun off in a single barrage. I've seen it. You stack that on top of the fact that the Stuka has like a potential of 2 barrages, as does the Wesp. If you don't place these things far enough back, you will lose them and it won't be worth it. What I love about these is the charged rounds. And actually, like, both of their veterancy options are really nice. I'm going to pop them open here. So the charge shells and artillery support are both quite nice abilities, especially if you're doing a lot of retreating from base, or maybe you have a medical tent that is close to your howitzer. Using this can be a great way to inspire your troops and get them on the field quicker, and they can close the gap. And man, let me tell you, with Rangers, this is way more devastating. I actually think this is a really slept on ability, because all you have to essentially do, think about it this way. So say you went through a big engagement and you had to retreat back to your medical tent, and your medical tent happens to be nearby your howitzer that is already vet 1, okay? Once you've done that and you've recouped all your losses, lead your troops with the artillery support barrage. So, you know, use a scout on the front line or something, maybe shoot a flare to find a target to barrage. Then as you're exiting your staging area, this will trigger. And all your infantry are going to get a really long buff that lasts 45 seconds and is going to allow you to come back into that territory that you just lost and really effectively attack it because of all of the buffs that they get. 20% harder to hit, 40% speed on infantry, dude. They're so fast. And 50% reduced suppression. Really, really effective passive that I think is pretty underutilized right now. Next, charge shells. This is like a super unique artillery passive. I love it. I think it's so cool. I don't want any more of it. I don't want any other artillery to have it because I certainly don't want the effects of this to come up in like every single game. But man, the ability to like shock vehicles with this is really nice. You can set up for some really nice attacks and even like respond to enemy attacks with these shock charge shells. Both of these options are exceptional. If you can have like 2 howitzers with one of each of these, or even like if you're going to pick 2, just do 2 charge shells, I would say, if you're not going to use artillery support. Sometimes artillery support can be hard to use if your medical tent is like too close to the front line, your howitzers are near the back. Obviously, you can't use that. So generally speaking, like I'm usually going for multiple charge shells, but artillery support has a place and time as well. I think if these emplacements ever get a buff in terms of survivability, then this will be much more useful. But for right now, charge shells is probably the better choice. It also increases the area of effect on the howitzer by 2, which makes the AoE on this thing super big. Let's actually put them side by side if we can here. M2, no, howitzer. There we go, 105. Let's compare it to like the Bishop. This is there we go. So looking at the gun on each, you can see AoE radius for this is 6. Radius for the howitzer is 9. Oh my gosh. I wonder if that's with charge shells. It must be, right? I would think so. That's crazy. Wow, that's huge. That is a massive AoE. I think that might be with charge shells. Anyway, just wanted to show that comparison side by side. So, overall, howitzer, strong as far as howitzers go, especially the emplacement type howitzers. The utility from this thing is super good. The main issue right now with it is the survivability element. Just make sure that if you're building these, you're building them really far away from the front line, because if a Stuka or a Wesp can get in range of this thing without getting intercepted by your frontline units, then you're going to have a problem. You're going to lose this for sure. Now, let's go to the other side of the tree. So we've got Rangers. We'll come back to the Rangers as a unit. Frontline medical station, designate assault position, Ranger weapon training, and infantry assault. So the Rangers themselves are super strong. They actually scale up to be OP 100%. Where they struggle is in the early game. In the early game, before they get some of their survivability and veterancy bonuses, they are pretty susceptible to being like bled by range units, because they all come with the Thompsons. Obviously, they want to close the gap. Generally, what I've been doing is I've been going for Riflemen, and then as the Riflemen scale to like Vet 2, then I convert them to Rangers. Because at Vet 2, Rangers get some really nice bonuses, as well as some buffs to their survivability. And you've kind of like bypassed the point in the game where it's very difficult to use them. And once you get into the late game, like if you get Vet 3 Rangers with like double bars, they're just complete Terminators. They're like the best infantry in the game, even better than Sauce Troop, and they're super, super strong. So I love the Rangers. I've been using this battle group a lot more recently. I'm trying to get like some good materials so I can get a good how-to for these guys out. Yeah. So that's all we'll say about Rangers. Weaknesses of the Rangers, the RNG of the weapon drop is a little questionable. Like it can, you know, sometimes you get good weapons, sometimes you get weapons you don't need. It kind of sucks. I think like a good way to think about using the weapon drops is generally what I'm doing in the early game is I'm not converting my Rangers. If I do convert them, I'll convert maybe one, and I'll prioritize flamethrowers as the weapon I want to pick up. Bars I might give to my Rifleman because it kind of complements their weapon profile a lot better. And 1919s I like to give to my Captain Squad if I have one, or Scouts, because they're much better at long range, and giving them the 1919 also gives them a nice boost to their long range firepower. But I'm not putting those weapons on the Rangers because the Rangers are designed to be CQC specialist, or in my opinion, anti-tank is the other option. And the other thing that you can do is, so if you've converted one Ranger in the early game and you're starting to spam the weapon drops and distribute the weapons to your troops, leave the bazookas for later, okay? Because what you can do is later on, if you've built like 3 rifles and you're playing with, maybe you converted one to a Ranger and you have 2 rifles, later on, you can convert one of those rifles to a Ranger. And if you've been stacking up those weapon crates, you may be able to emerge all of the sudden from your base with like a 3, 4, 5, or 6 bazooka Ranger squad, which is just going to be an absolute Terminator against vehicles on the battlefield. So that is a great way to be using the weapon drops with the Rangers and kind of mitigate for like the questionable weapon drops. What I wouldn't do is when you're dropping in your weapons, just pick up whatever comes. I wouldn't do that, honestly. There are some weapons that are just a straight up downgrade. 1919s, I don't really like on Rangers, I'm going to be honest. I don't really like the 1919s on the Rangers. The bars are okay, but I actually think they're better on your Rifleman in the meantime. And you can always equip them on your Rangers a little bit later on. The Thompsons are really nice. They have a really super high short range damage profile. Anyway, enough about Rangers. Designate assault position. This is kind of a niche ability, but can be really good and used to kind of push through or break through an enemy defensive line. Combining this with your Rangers once they get some veterancy, as well as the captain buff, can be really, really good at like breaking through the toughest area in an Axis defensive position. So very, very good, useful ability. I tend to favor Frontline Medical Station, especially in team games. This is super valuable. Even though it's crazy expensive, I'll tell you why this is amazing. Because the casualty collection mechanic works in this way. The medics have to walk out of the medical station to the casualty that has fallen, and then bring it back to the same medical station. Maybe you guys see where I'm going with this. So the time it takes for a medic on the frontline medical station to get to a casualty and collect it versus a medic in your base having to walk out to the field and collect a casualty, it's way shorter, which means you're collecting more casualties and you're getting way more manpower from this. Even though it's way more expensive than the base version of the medical tent, this version is going to provide a lot more value over the course of a long game. And of course, you know, wanting to keep your infantry topped up throughout the game is going to be your priority when you're playing this battle group and thinking about using Rangers. Finally, we've got infantry assault and Ranger weapon training. Both of these abilities are very strong. I recommend using infantry assault when you are floating a lot of munitions and not planning to use it for other things like maybe rapid barrage or whatever. This is a great way to continuously apply pressure to your opponent and frankly create a diversion, because what you want to do is use this as a frontline distraction that your opponent has no choice but to deal with, while your Rangers, your vehicles, and whatever else units you have do the real work. And come in on the flank and take things out, or target priority units, or take territory, whatever it is. This can be a very useful ability. And depending on how your Ranger weapon distribution went, based on the RNG of the crates, you may want to go for Ranger weapon training. If I got a good deal of like flamethrowers and bazookas, I'm usually going for this. This is usually a better choice. The utility of the flamethrowers and the synergy that it has with the short range damage profile of the Thompsons makes the Rangers super, super dangerous. And then also the debuffs that are applied on units through the bazooka are also very nice. The 1919 and the bar bonuses are good as well, but the flamer and the bazookas are my favorite. So overall, sorry, I don't think I talked about this side of the tree. Because of how we talked about using the Howitzer, I would not recommend free fire drills. This is just a better choice. It's just basically just a quick a call-in artillery barrage, good for dislodging enemy defensive positions or destroying fortifications or whatever else. So overall, I think this battle group definitely in the strong category. Rangers will scale up to be OP. You just have to be very careful about whether or not you're going to build a bunch of them in the early game. There's only a handful of maps, especially in team game settings, that I would consider using these guys early. Otherwise, what I'm usually doing is I'm building my Riflemen, vetting them up a little bit, and then converting them to Rangers later on. As far as the artillery scouts go, they're probably in the average category. This brings us to Armored. Oh my god, Armored, dude. Armored Battle Group has been, hands down, bar none, the most overpowered battle group in the game for over 2 years. Since the game was released, this battle group, in a 1v1 context specifically, this is the most egregious. But I think it's also going to be, people are going to realize that this is also very good in team game settings as well. So Armored Battle Group going straight up into OP. We'll break it down in terms of the abilities and the complete structure over here. So left side, right side. Right side, we have Fast Deploy, Strength and Steel, Scott, Seek and Destroy, and then we have access to the call-in version of the EZ8 or the producible version. Generally speaking, Fast Deploy is the better of these choices for the purpose of tempo. In team game settings, Strength and Steel might make more sense. Being able to get your units and your vehicles on the field faster in a 1v1 game or small 2v2 game can make a very big difference in terms of the shock value of that unit. But Strength and Steel is probably makes more sense for games that are going to go longer, like a team game setting. The other nice thing, though, about Fast Deploy is that like you can very reactively build vehicles. Because normally, like, if you see your opponent has something, you're like, oh my god, I need a GMC, or I need a Greyhound, or a Chaffee. It's like, you have to wait like a minute to build it. 45 seconds at least, between 45 seconds and a minute. This basically speeds that up to be like 10 to 15 seconds, which is really nice. There's been lots of situations where it's like I get a killing blow on an opponent's Greyhound, and then another one is up in my face like 20 seconds later. It's a real pain in the ass. So Fast Deploy, Strength and Steel, both really good. Assault Engineers and Veteran Crews, both really good. Assault Engineers will pretty much beat Grenadiers by running at them. They are super beefy, and they have good, really good repair speed. So this is great if you're planning on playing a heavy mechanized or vehicle-heavy composition. But Veteran Crews is also very nice. I talked about the synergy between Veteran Crews and the M3 Halftrack. You can build the M3 from your weapon support center and just start plopping down those free what are they called? Free fighting pits like crazy. And then just, spending the munitions to upgrade them into mortars. And you can just like spam them like crazy before you decide to upgrade your M3s. So this has really nice synergy. And then of course with your Greyhound or your Chaffees, instant access to the Vet 1 really, really bolsters their capabilities. After that, we have the M31 recovery vehicle. This is the American version of the same kind that the DAC has. This unit is really, really great, especially as you get into the late game. There's usually lots of options for you to either recover friendly or enemy vehicles and also salvage wrecks for resources. Field repairs. I'm not seeing this too much. If you're going like a crazy heavy like motor pool composition, say like, I don't know, like 5 or 6 vehicles, and you do like a big push, but you take a bunch of damage and you don't have time to like repair before you want to go in and do another wave or another attack. Field repairs can be a really nice way to handle that, because the vehicles, they come out of combat, they quickly repair themselves, and then you can just quickly zoom back in and devastate your opponent, and they'll be like, dude, what the hell? I just did a bunch of damage to these. So this is a great ability for that purpose. And then we have War Machine. This has been broken for way too long, but basically reduces the manpower cost of all vehicles by 25%. Vehicles from production buildings, so it doesn't apply to the EZ8 call-in group. Yeah, this reduces the manpower cost of all vehicles. US is already a very manpower efficient faction, and this just pushes them completely over the edge and is what makes armored battle groups so strong. To put that into perspective, the EZ8, which is the best medium tank in the game, becomes cheaper on manpower cost than like a Panzer IV. The EZ8 becomes 330 manpower. Panzer IV is 360. A standard Sherman without War Machine is 340. This is 330. Like, it's crazy. It's just crazy. On the other side of the tree, we talked about these two. The Scott is a decent unit. It's a great lobber. The turret on top makes it highly accessible to use. It's a very easy to use unit. This is great on urban maps or maps where you can kind of park it behind something and continuously lob rounds over to harass your opponent. Generally, I prefer the Scott over Seek and Destroy. Seek and Destroy is okay. It's good if you're planning like a big push with like motor pool, for example, or late game pushes with your vehicles. But the power of this ability previously used to be in the fact that it would give a massive rate of fire bonus, which thank God, honestly, they took away. It was way too strong. But you can see extra speed, extra accuracy, so more likely to hit your target, and 10% increased vision. This is what you're going to want to be using when you're doing big vehicle pushes, either with motor pool or in the late game with tier 4. Here we have the EZ8 combat group and the producible version of the EZ8. I lean towards this. It's much better from an economic standpoint over a longer game than this option. But you can go for this one when you're in a pinch. It is pretty expensive, as you can see. But it does also come with a engineer escort, which can be really nice, especially if you've gone for assault engineers. Talking about the EZ8 itself. So here, let's go over to the units. We talked about assault engineers. They're going in the strong category. M31 is, it is what it is. I actually think this is strong. This is definitely good. Scott, probably, it's in average now because the CP cost of it got increased. So it comes out a little bit later than it did last patch. But it's still, it's still a very decent light barrager type unit. Kind of a Stummel equivalent, but a little bit more expensive and a little bit better. It's more durable, it's faster, and it's got a turret, which is kind of nice. And then the EZ8. The EZ8 is the best medium tank in the game, period. There's a couple reasons for that. Let me see if I can crack open the EZ8. Yep, there we go. So, same armor as the Sherman, but the main difference is it has more health than the Sherman, better accel decel, and it also has, I wonder if I can find this. There it is. It has perfect accuracy on the move. It's the only tank in the game that, because of this, I know the EZ8 suspension system was like pretty famous for this. It had really like low negative implications on like the accuracy of the main gun. And so this is the only vehicle in the game that has a perfect moving accuracy multiplier. What this means is that the EZ8 is as likely to hit the target when it's moving or standing still, and this is the only tank in the game that that's true for. On top of that, it also has an exceptional AoE profile, similar to the 76mm Sherman, but a little bit better. And then, of course, it has all of the same machine guns, and it also has access to HVAP rounds as part of its kit for, like, it's not behind a Veterancy unlock. This is just accessible to use whenever. So when you mass, 3 or so Easy 8s, you're pretty much guaranteed to be able to take out something big like a KT or a Tiger, as long as you're popping the HVAP rounds, you get good positioning, and you close the gap quickly. But yeah, Easy 8, best medium tank in the game. And like I mentioned before, with the benefits of, where is it? War Machine, these things get super cheap in terms of manpower, and they're only slightly more expensive than like a Panzer IV in terms of fuel. They're 110 fuel. But amazing unit. Best medium tank in the game, belongs to the Americans. They get that. The Crusader, actually, I could probably make an argument that the Crusader is a better medium tank, but like in terms of raw stats and raw performance on a per unit basis, the Easy 8 is by far the best. Next, that takes us to Airborne, the last of the battle groups. So, Airborne is interesting, and it's in a pretty decent position, I would say. So we'll start with aerial support. The smoke bombing run is okay. I feel like it arrives too late. I feel like it takes too long to arrive. And so a lot of the time, for that reason, I'm usually going for the recon loiter. The smoke bombing run is good for setting things up, but it's not good for reactively using. I know in COH3, for example, smoke runs were very commonly used in a defensive context to like save a retreating squad or help protect a retreating tank or something like that. And in this game, they just take way too long to show up for that to work. But if you have like some good vision on your enemy's line and you want to blind them before closing the gap, then the ability can be good for that. Generally, I like to favor the recon loiter, but obviously, like we talked about, as far as anti-aircraft weapons go, they are very meta for the Axis factions at the moment. And so usually the recon loiter is not lasting super long. So neither of these are usually great spends unless you know for sure that they don't have anti-aircraft. Next, we have supply drop and paradrop reinforcements. Paradrop reinforcements, it kind of has the same problem. If your opponent's building a lot of AA, it's not good. But if they're not, this is actually a super good early game ability. You can use smoke bombing run to kind of bypass recon loiter and get this super early at 2 CP and apply a ton of early game pressure by just the ability to freely reinforce the squads that are attacking a position. And you could just apply a ton of early game pressure using this. It can be very good. Supply drop is obviously the better choice for a longer game, I would say. And obviously it's going to be more reliable because these planes can't be shot down. The medical supplies on the front line can be very nice, especially in a team game context. And the munitions are going to keep you stocked up for your uses of the dual P-47 rocket strike and or the carpet bombing run, as well as making sure that your troops are well supplied with weapons. That takes us to the two abilities. I think the P-47 rocket strike is easily like the S tier apex tank killing ability in the game right now. I think this thing is the only I'm pretty sure it's the only ability in the game that can just one-shot a tank if you hit it in the right spot. Now, quick tip about the P-47 rocket strike: make sure that the plane is always flying in from behind your target, because that means that it's more likely to hit it if your opponent happens to reverse, and you're actually going to be hitting them in the rear armor, which means you're going to deal bonus damage to those bigger tanks like the mediums and the heavies. And this will one-shot, like the KT basically cannot avoid this. It's like virtually impossible. If you manage to snare the KT, it's like a guaranteed kill if you throw this on top of it. Carpet bombing run I've talked about. The best way to use the carpet bombing run is to either use it when your opponent is distracted on something else, or use it either behind them or on top of them to create a pocket that you can close. I like using it behind my opponent because what that does is I commit to an attack and they have two choices. They either have to run back into the bombing run or they just have to stand their ground, and that's usually not what you want to be doing, especially if you're attacking with vehicles. You need to kind of like kite backwards. So both of these are fantastic abilities, and supply drop really facilitates them over the course of a longer game. Now let's talk about paradropped infantry. Pathfinders, really solid upgrade to the scout. The access to the rifle grenades makes them really good. Very combat capable. They get a bunch of accuracy at Vet 2, which makes them even more combat capable. So this highly underrated unit, I think, in team games because it's overshadowed by the HMG Paradrop, which is also very strong. But yeah, I'm a big fan of the Pathfinders. They also have great utility. They have great veterancy options with their... like, I really like the passive healing. I kind of talked about this with the artillery observers. The free healing out of combat is really nice. Helps you stay on the field much longer. The HMG Paradrop team probably makes more sense inside of a team game context, so you can secure a hard point and get access to strong cover positions before your opponent does. Something kind of unique and cheeky about this team is that the crew members have M1 carbines that actually have decent penetration against the Kradschützen and the Kettenkrad in like the super early game. So even if you're not able to shoot at them with the 1919 itself, the the crew members can actually... I actually had a game where the crew members on the 1919 team almost killed my Kettenkrad, and I didn't even notice because I was parked like outside of the firing arc. Anyway, both of these options, very good. Pathfinders probably make a little bit more sense in the small team game setting, and HMG Paradrop in the large team game setting. Paratroopers. I love Paratroopers. They got some great buffs in the last couple patches, but they need to be used with the LMGs, in my opinion, to be honest. The reason why is because their scaling and their veterancy are built around durability and staying power. Now, this can be pretty good with the bazookas because you get extra rate of fire as well. But like, the bazookas don't scale on the paratroopers specifically. So I'll just like, I'll show you guys, like I'll compare them to like a bazooka squad. Here, let's open up a bazooka squad. Units. Bazooka squad. So the veterancy on the bazooka squad, they give extra weapon penetration to the bazookas, which help them scale into the late game. The paratroopers do not get this bonus, which means like if you're fighting Stugs or you're fighting P4s or whatever, like you're gonna have a hard time punching through them with the bazookas from the paratroopers. What I prefer is if I'm playing if I'm playing airborne, usually I'm gonna go weapon support center, and I'll build a couple bazooka squads because they will scale much better throughout the game, and they also have access to the steady fire ability as well. The paratroopers are perfect for the 1919s. They become a long-range powerhouse, super durable, and their veterancy choices make them... So Season Hold and Packed Explosives are both very good. Season Hold, I mean, if I'm building 2 paratroopers or 3, I usually do like 2 of them with Season Hold, maybe 1 with Packed Explosives. Season Hold is amazing because they are great anchors on your VPs and like the highly contested territory points. They get extra damage reduction, and it stacks further at Vet 2, which makes them really, really beefy, like really difficult to dislodge as they get veterancy. And so for that reason, I'm a big fan of paratroopers. And the 1919s, as they scale into Vet 3, they become really, really good, really powerful line infantry substitute. The main issue with airborne compositions is usually the lack of snares, but as long as you have like bazookas, you know, maybe get like a GMC from Weapon Support Center, plant lots of mines, you should be fine. So I think that takes us to, I think, last thing here. Oh yeah, we also have a Paradrop AT gun. This is really nice because it also allows you to kind of bypass motor pool if you like, but still make it through the mid game with the help of some anti-tank guns. So this option is really nice as well. I've seen lots of like Rifleman based builds that also like to leverage these anti-tank gun paradrops, heavy investment into infantry support center upgrades, and then in the late game using like the rocket strikes in combination with Rifleman and the AT guns to deal with the heavy tanks. Can be really nice. So airborne itself, so I'll place the units first. Pathfinders definitely in the strong category. Because they're definitely better than these guys. They get a little bit extra utility, and they get the rifle grenades, which is really nice. MG Paradrop, definitely in the OP category alongside the 30 cal. It's basically the 30 cal, but you get to drop it into the map, which is great. Paratroopers, not OP, but very strong. Very good unit, very solid. Overall, as far as the entire scope of the battle group goes, I would say it's definitely in the strong category, probably towards the lower end alongside SSF. I feel like these two new battle groups are a bit of a cut above. The Ranger battle group, advanced infantry, I don't know, these are all kind of scattered within the strong category. It really comes down to the user, right? It really comes down to like making good use of these tools together, complementing the existing basic tech tree for USF. That is, I think, the way to go about it. Yeah, each battle group has some really clear gaps in their roster and weak points. I feel like USF right now has a kind of a rough mid game unless you're playing weapon support center composition, which, like I said, I just don't enjoy as much. It's just not as much fun for me. I like to play with Riflemen, but right now, like, they require so much investment from a fuel standpoint that it becomes difficult to get out some of these mid-game vehicles like the Chaffee, the Greyhound, etc. So yeah. There we go. Those are all the units. Those are all the battle groups. We're up at 240. I think we're going to be pushing it into 3 hours looking at the support centers, but I think it's important to break down. I'll say with the air support center, yeah, I was going to say if this is first, I'll be short. I'll be short with this. So I talked a lot in this video about how I feel like the Axis anti-aircraft options are too accessible and too meta for this to be really useful, especially in a team game setting. I really like this change that they made, where it's like, now it's possible with one or so anti-aircraft weapon on the field for the plane to still deliver its payload before dying. But if there's more than one, especially in the same area, you're still going to run into the same problem where it's like you can't really use any of these abilities. The other thing about why I don't like Air Support Center in general is because it's very munitions heavy. Unless you're playing airborne, like, you need those munitions for other things. You need them for bars, you need them for grenades, you need them for mines, you need them for half-track upgrades, you need them for your Greyhound skirts and the 50 cal. Like, you need munitions for everything. US is a very munitions heavy faction, and having to spend or try to spend your munitions on these air support abilities that are a little bit expensive, I just don't really think it's worth it. So for that reason, the air support center is going into the bad tier for me. That's just my opinion. Next, let's go into infantry support center. This, to me, is probably the strongest one at the moment. Now, what really pushes this into the category I'm going to put it in is actually the fact that it's the only support center that comes with the captain, and it's free. The captain is a free unit with the support center. that gives the captain gives a ton of tempo, the captain gives a ton of utility, and then you combine that with some of these upgrades, and it just makes the US infantry just scale exceptionally well. And that's really like kind of what you want in the late game. Like, you kind of need these upgrades to make sure that your infantry can compete with the Axis counterparts. And these upgrades are the best way to do that. Accessibility to demolitions package is really nice. Munition surplus is also really nice if you're planning to use like a lot of mines, grenades, etc. Getting this early on is a great idea because it's really going to reduce the munitions burden on you over the course of a long game. So infantry support center as a category, I'm actually going to put it in the S tier. I think it's just like a cut above all the other ones still. I think it's very closely related to the fact that it comes with the captain for free. What I would like to see, Relic, if you are listening, what I would like to see is infantry support center, fine. Let it come with the captain for free. But these other support centers, let me build the captain from my headquarters. I'll pay for it, okay? The captain is really what sets the infantry support center apart. And the fact that I don't have access to it with Mechanized Support Center or Air Support Center is just like, it sucks. You know, it's really like the main reason that I pick Infantry Support Center as often as I do is because of the captain. I think if the captain was accessible with the Mechanized Support Center or the Air Support Center, I mean, you could even tune the unit a little bit, like maybe give it some slightly different abilities based on the support center of your choice. But like, I just feel like these other support centers need the captain. And I would be more than willing to pay the 150 manpower for it, and while keeping it free for the infantry support center. So that's infantry support center. Mechanized support center. All of this stuff is great. The 76mm Sherman upgrade, we kind of talked about how much that benefits the Sherman and helps it scale as a late game option. Rapid repairs, I mean, this is kind of meh. Like, you know, I'm not finding myself changing my designate forward repair station that often. The extra repair speed is kind of nice. What I would say is that I've seen a good chunk of people try to use MSC with armored, and I just feel like there's too much overlap. I would not recommend going Mechanized Support Center with Armored Battlegroup. Armored Battlegroup pretty much provides inherently a lot of the same benefits, and so for that reason, I would probably just bypass this support center if you're going for armored. This is much better if you're going for the Ranger Battlegroup or especially special operations, I think, and even airborne. Airborne is very good with this too. The best part of this support center, bar none, is improvised armor, especially with how meta the Jaeger and handheld Jaeger Shreks and the Tank Buster Shreks for DAC. How meta and powerful those have become. Being able to reduce that damage by 25% and increase all of your armor facings by 20% makes a huge difference in the survivability of your tanks against those units and against the Axis late game units. This, just as a quick note, like this improvised armor brings the Pershing frontal armor almost up to the same value as the Tiger if you get the improvised armor. So it's really, really nice. And it's really going to help your vehicles scale. It actually tips the scale in favor of the Sherman against the P4 if you're fighting like frontal armor to frontal armor. So yeah, Mechanized Support Center overall, I'm going to put it in the strong category. It's, you know, it's much better than it was in previous patches. There's definitely a place for it, but I do still think Infantry Support Center is just a cut above everything else. This last thing is kind of just like a note for me, and I was talking to Dumais about this, another prominent community member, streamer. We both had the idea of exchanging Air Support Center for some kind of like artillery support center. it would be really cool if you could have like a base artillery similar to the 25 pounder of the UKF, with various like indirect fire upgrades that are purchasable in this support center. And it would have a lot less of the issues that Air Support Center has, because Air Support Center is basically just like, it's super munitions expensive and it's easily countered by anti-aircraft. And an artillery support center wouldn't have that same problem. And the other thing that US lacks right now is non-doctrinal artillery, because the pack howitzer is garbage. The Whizbang is okay, but it's tied to a battle group. The Howitzer is okay, but it's tied to a battle group. So it just kind of puts us in this weird situation when we're playing as US, where it's like we don't have the proper indirect fire outside of the M1 Mortar, which is very good, but it's not a late game option, right? And so I think if Relic were to bring in some kind of artillery support center where it's like we've got a base howitzer that we can use similar to the UKF 25 pounder, and you know there's upgrades to indirect fire within as something purchasable, like I don't know, increasing blast radius, or reduce cooldown on smoke barrages, or like you could do all kinds of really cool and creative things with an artillery support center. And I just think that's really what the US roster is lacking right now. So that's kind of just like the last comment that I had. Well, that's it, guys. We did it. We're coming up on 3 hours. This is our USF tier list. Be really interested to see people's insight and input on whether or not they think, you know, this is accurate, if I'm way off base on some things. But as you can see, you know, I still feel like, you guys will notice this about a lot of my tier lists. Like, I don't put that many things in average or bad unless I feel like there's really no way to make more of that unit, and it really just like it needs a buff, you know, or it needs something to be competitive. All of these units, they definitely have clear weaknesses, but like they can be used to a really effective capacity in the right hands. And that's really what it comes down to when it comes to playing US. I do want to comment on, like, I know a lot of people feel like US is like really bad in team games. And the reason that's the case is because US, in order to be most effective, they need space. And they need to be, I say this a lot to my coaching students, like, the best way to play US is to pick your opponent apart by forcing them all over the map. And in 4v4 and 3v3 settings, it's really difficult to do that because the maps are much smaller relative to the number of players on them compared to 1v1 and 2v2s. And that's why US struggles so much. So, I mean, you know, the ways that this could be mitigated is like, I don't know. I think there's a lot of things that would probably need to be changed about the faction in order to correct this issue. But like, you guys just, when you're playing US, you really need a mindset shift that is different from playing Wehrmacht or DAC or British. Playing in a big blob as US is not the most effective way to do it. With Wehrmacht, with UKF, with DAC, oftentimes it is. Oftentimes it is best to play in a blob. But with US, like, most of the time, it's not. The best thing to do is to hit your opponent from all sides, have them distracted, have many micro engagements happening at the same time. You know, like your rifleman engaging different units one-on-one in many different places of the map. That's when you're going to be the most effective. But when you're starting to do blob v blob stuff, the US player is going to struggle. You're going to suffer. And the lack of indirect fire just adds to that. So anyway, I'm going to stop yapping about balance. This is the tier list. I hope you guys appreciate it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I will be doing DAC next. Of course, it is the last faction on the tier list agenda. I am going to be continuing the battle group how-tos. That series is going to continue. Until I've got all the way through. I've decided to do all of them, honestly. I just think it would be good for everybody to have a guide for the battle group that they like, whether it's good or not. And so I will be making one for all of them eventually. It's just gonna obviously take me time to get the material and then obviously put the commentary over top of some good material that I think will be entertaining and educational for you guys. So with that, I'm gonna leave it. Take a screenshot. Hope you guys got some good insights, learned a couple things, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. See you, nerds.